Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this seminar today on enforced disappearance in the pathways of transitional justice. I would like to start by introducing myself. I am Qabool Labsi, the head of the Qarar Foundation for Media and a member of the Yemen Peace Forum. This seminar is a part of the series of activities on Transitional Justice Week from the 29th of August to September 2nd, 2025 in partnership with the Sanaa Center and organized by the Yemen Peace Forum. Our first activity comes in parallel with the International Day for Enforced Disappearance, which is one of the most dangerous, severe human rights violations in Yemen. It has caused intensive suffering for communities and families over decades. This seminar will discuss enforced disappearance, potential solutions to resolve it as a part of the process of transitional justice, as well as what mechanisms are available for truth-seeking, for accountability, for reparations, and non-repetition. We will also focus on shining light on the efforts of civil society organizations with the families of the forcibly disappeared and how we could support these efforts in the pathways or processes of transitional justice. We will focus on three main topics. The first main topic, which is severe violations of human rights or grave violations of human rights, disappearance as a model, which will be covered by Raghda Al-Maqtari. We'll discuss the suffering of disappeared and the pathways of transitional justice, which will be presented and then we will hear about the efforts of the families of the to achieve welcome all the panelists that we have today in this session. Let us start by discussing grave human rights violations with enforced disappearance being a basic model of it. And we will discuss this with Raghda Al-Maqtari, who is a lawyer and human rights defender. She is currently a member of the Council of the Bar Association in Ta'ad, where she is responsible for rights and freedoms. She is also an advisor on women and children's issues and provides legal support for abused women. She also works as a trainer with civil society organizations and human rights, and currently works on the National Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations, where she documents and monitors these violations and provides legal support. Raghda, when we talk about human rights in Yemen, we find that the violations or the scale of violations have gone past individual violations or crimes to crimes against humanity. And enforced disappearance has become clearly one of the most dangerous of these violations, as it not only targets the victims, but also impacts the community and the families of the forcibly disappeared. It leads to people losing their trust or their confidence in the law and in the state. And so from your perspective, how can we view enforced disappearance as a model of other violations in the Yemeni context? So not just at the individual level, but how it impacts society as a whole and the pathways of transitional justice. Over to you, Raghda.
بالضبط يا قبول أنت تكلمتي عن
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Qabool, and hello, everyone. Qabool, you mentioned enforced disappearance as being one of the most severe violations that affect human dignity, and it is one of the most dangerous human rights violations, like you said, as it not only affects the victim, but also affects their family members and members of their community. And this is not just limited to a sense of a lack of security and the concern for the victim, but also fear for their relatives, for their local community, and for society as a whole. And that is why the crime of enforced disappearance is one of the most dangerous violations that affect human dignity and human rights. Before going in depth into enforced disappearance, it's important for us to understand what the legal definition for the crime of enforced disappearance is. And to define this, we can define it based on the International Convention to Protect Individuals from Enforced Disappearance, which was in 2006 and went into effect in 2010.
الاتفاقية تعرف الاختفاء القسري بأنه إما الاعتقال أو
It defines it as abduction or detention or abduction or any other form of deprivation of freedom by state officials or personnel, individuals individuals or groups of individuals who operate with the support or the acceptance of the state, and this includes deprivation of freedom or hiding the fate of the person and not allowing them access to their legal rights. And based on this definition, we can talk about the components of this crime or this violation, which based on the definition is a deprivation of freedom. Like we mentioned, it could be abduction or detention or arrest, and that this is done by state or state-affiliated entities. And this needs to also be or include also deprivation of freedom and depriving their family of knowing their fate. This also includes deprivation and concealment of the fates or the whereabouts of the disappeared person. And so these are the components of this of the definition of this violation, and this is what makes enforced disappearance different from other crimes that are included in national legislation. Other crimes like abduction or arbitrary detention, but the component of deprivation of they all have deprivation of liberty, but enforced disappearance includes state involvement and denial of information or removal from legal protection, whereas abduction is usually carried out by individuals not affiliated with the state, whereas arbitrary detention is the detention of an individual without a legal basis. If we look at the legal framework for combating this crime, we have a full framework in international humanitarian law, and Yemen is one of the countries that has signed 56 of these conventions in general. And these conventions, which have spoken about enforced disappearance, in the beginning, it wasn't in their direct or clear mention of it, but they include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which mentioned this crime, that no individual can be detained arbitrarily, and that this was one of the forms of enforced disappearance. Also, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights also mentioned the crime of enforced disappearance. And like I said, it was not directly or explicitly stated, but all of these rights that are included in this convention
تحت حرمان الشخص في هذه الجريمة بالتالي أيضا لدينا بجانب العهد
we also have the international convention. In addition to this convention, we have the Convention Against Torture, which and this is considered to be a form of psychological torture, and it includes the crime of enforced disappearance. We also have the Universal Declaration, which is the first, this is the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. This was the first statement or document issued by the United Nations that mentioned this explicitly, and it laid the legal groundwork for combating this crime. And so we have the Declaration of the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, and then the convention on that, which is the first legally binding text. But as we all know, Yemen has not ratified this agreement, and this agreement and its items stated that no person must be subject to enforced disappearance. It also defined enforced disappearance and mentioned that this is a crime against humanity. And in Article 6, it stated that no exceptional circumstances may be used as a justification, including war or internal instability, and that all of the state parties must adhere to all of the articles and items in this agreement, and to take all necessary legislative and judicial measures and ensure that investigations are swift. Okay. It also has the Fourth Geneva Convention and the two additional protocols, which are in effect during armed conflict. And it also mentioned one form of this crime, the crime of enforced disappearance. We also have the Rome Statutes of the ICC, which mentioned that enforced disappearance is a crime against humanity, and it presented two conditions. conditions. First, that it is a widespread practice or a systemic practice that is directed against any group of the population, of the civilian population. And so this is with regards to the international legal framework. And if we try to differentiate between enforced disappearance but as a crime against humanity, as we mentioned, needs to be done on a broader scale, and that it is done systemically. But in the legal framework in Yemen, the Yemeni constitution mentions the affecting others, individuals' freedoms, and also the or the penal code also mentioned the legal guarantees for individuals who are detained or had been arrested. There's also the penitentiary code and the abduction law, which was the first law that was issued by Yemen on this topic in general. And we also have the laws of war, which are the military code. And so all of this frameworks are an attempt to combat the crime or violation of enforced disappearance. But as we've mentioned, Yemen unfortunately has not signed on to or ratified this agreement. And so within this full and comprehensive legal framework, and despite the fact that this framework is there, the crime of enforced disappearance has still not been combated. There are also legal and humanitarian ramifications. As we mentioned, it is a crime against humanity, and it is a violation of all of the previously mentioned legal frameworks. And there are humanitarian ramifications with the state of fear among the relatives of the victim, and also the suspension of their legal rights, as they have not been given the right to appear in a court of law. There's also a problem with the impunity and lack of accountability with the perpetrators of this violation. And so, since we've mentioned the legal frameworks, the crime of enforced disappearance, it is a series of violations that target the basic rights of individuals. And what are these basic rights that are being violated by this crime? The first is the right to life, to dignity, and to personal security as dictated by laws. And this always puts these individuals at risk as their psychological and Ragda, if you could please slow down a bit, maybe for the interpretation. You can select the language that you would like to hear the simultaneous interpretation. And if anyone has any questions during the panelists' interventions, you can write them in the Q&A section in the Zoom meeting, and they will be answered. And also, like we mentioned, as this is a series of violations, because it is not a single crime, but the violation of enforced disappearance is a complex crime in which several rights have been violated: the right to freedom, to dignity, to personal safety and security, and it also deprives them of the right to life, as the victim who has been killed outside of the scope of the law, and they also have been subject to torture and to harsh treatment or mistreatment, and they have also been deprived of their right to a legal status. This individual has also been deprived of the right to a fair trial. They have been deprived of the right to have humane circumstances in their detention, and these detentions include secret prisons and sometimes in homes or residences that do not meet any of the conditions that prisons would need to adhere to based on the Mandela principles. This crime does not violate it destroys which impacts the victim, and not just the victim, but also the relatives and their family. The forms of enforced disappearance, if we look at the different forms of enforced disappearance, victims are detained without any warrants, and they are detained in secret prisons, like we said, in homes or residences that have been turned into prisons. They are usually captured in night raids, or they are abducted in the security checkpoints throughout the main roads and public streets. They are taken from streets, from shops, from hospitals, and so they are detained and raided in different areas without any legal justification for this. During the arrests or the detention, there are several violations of their rights, because the crime of enforced disappearance also there are forms of torture that are used in parallel. And during our documentation of the victims, they spoke about the physical torture. One of the mothers spoke to us, for example, and said that before her son was taken from her, his fingernails were pulled out.
وولدها أيضا مصاب بالسكري وهي إلى اليوم لا تعرف
And her
مصيره.
son has
كل
diabetes, and
يوم
she still
تأتي
has
إلينا
not been able
وتتحدث
to find out his
بنسيج
fate. And
أخرى
she comes to
تتحدث
visit us
بأنها
from time
تحلم
to time and
بولدها
tells us that
أنه
she has dreams
يأتي
of her son
إليها
coming
المهم
to her,
أنه في بعض الناس وصلوا لها إنه
even though
الولد
some
مات
people have already
لكن
told
كل
her
يوم
or
تجي لعندنا
information
وتقول
is
لنا
leaked
لا
that her son has
أنا
died in
أشوف جثة
detention.
أنا بعرف
But
إنه
she
ابني
comes and
كان
tells us that as
صار
long as she has not seen a body, then
مازال
she will still believe
حي.
that her son is still alive.
فتحدثت عن التعذيب
And so
الجسدي
she
قبل
spoke
عمليات
about the physical
اعتقاله
torture of her son
وبعد
before
كده
his
اللي
detention or
هو
during the
عملية
detention,
إخفائه
and
القسري
then
إلى
his
اليوم
enforced
من
disappearance from
2018 إلى اليوم لا
2018
تعرف
until today.
هل
And this
ولدها
mother
ما
does not
زال
know
حي
if
أم
if her
لأنها
son is
ذكرتها
still
لم
alive
تستلم
or
أي
has
جثة
passed because she has not received
من
the
وسائل
body.
أيضا من
If
وسائل
we have just a minute left.
أوكي من الوسائل
Okay,
أيضا
thank
كما
you.
ذكرنا اللي هو الضرب
Another,
المبرح
there's
هناك
also the
آثار
severe
تعد
mistreatment.
هذه الجريمة من الجرائم اللي تحدثنا أنها
And these
جرائم
are one of the,
ضد
these are
الإنسانية
considered to
لأنه
be
آثار
crimes
لا
against
تطال
humanity
فقط
because their impact does
الضحية
not just affect
تطال الأسرة
the
التي
victim, but
تحدثنا
also
عنها
their families.
تطالهم بشكل أو بآخر صدمات اكتئابات قلق
This
مشاكل
leads to
صحية جسدية
psychological and also physical
أحيانا بعض
problems
الضحايا
among
يتم
the victims.
قتلهم
Some of the victims are
لسبب
also
ذلك
killed without their families being
تعاني
informed of
عائلات
this, with their
وأصدقاء
fates being concealed.
المقتولين قسرا من
And the
الاضطرابات
families
معاناة
of the
نفسية
victims of enforced
اجتماعية
disappearance face social
واقتصادية أثر
stigmatization
الأكبر
and also
دائما
an
على
economic and
النساء
social or even cultural
والأطفال وعلى
impact. And
المجتمع وعلى أيضا
usually
الحرية
women and children bear the
والاستقرار
brunt
هناك
of
حالات
this
رصدتها جميع المنظمات هنا
suffering. There are many
دائما
cases that
نحب العلم أنه
organizations have
يجب
documented,
الإبلاغ عن عمليات الاختفاء القسري
and
وعن
we always
عمليات
talk about the importance of
ال-
these
الاعتقالات
violations
حتى
or these
يتم
crimes
توثيقها
being
ويتم إدراجها ضمن
reported
إطار
so that they
العدالة
can be
الانتقالية
documented and they can
فيما
be
بعد
included in
فيجب
the
على جميع
mechanisms of
الأطراف
transitional
النزاع أن
justice
تتوقف
afterwards.
فورا عن
It
جميع
is
حالات
important for all of
الاختفاء
the warring
القسري
parties to
والاعتقالات
immediately
أن
stop
يقدم
all
جميع
forms of
الأوقاف
enforced disappearance
معلومات
and
فورية عن
detentions, and
أماكن
for the
الأشخاص الذين
warring
تم
parties to provide
إخفاؤهم وإطلاق
immediate
سراح جميع
information on all
المحتجزين
of
إلى
the
جانب ذلك
individuals who
يجب
were
على
forcibly
الحكومة
disappeared
اليمنية
and to secure
إعطاء
their release.
الأولوية
And the Yemeni
للتوثيق على
government
هذه
must make it a
الاتفاقية
priority to
وتقييم
ratify
الاختفاء
this
القسري
convention
كجريمة جنائية مستقلة في
and to
القانون وليسوا
criminalize
أهالي
enforced
الضحايا أتمنى
disappearance
أني
as a
أكون
separate
عرجت على الجريمة
violation in the law.
بشكل
I
أو
hope that I was
بآخر
able to give
ولضيق
a
الوقت
clear overview of this
أرجو أن
crime.
أكون
معنا جولة
لميت
ثانية.
بالموضوع
If there are any
لا
additional
ثانية.
questions, we can take them during the
رغدة.
Q&A. Thank you very much, Ragda. I
تذكر
think you gave us a very important overview of the conventions and the laws, and you also mentioned the impact that forced disappearance has on the victims themselves and those around them. I would like to reiterate, if any of the participants have any questions, you can write them in the Q&A box and we can answer it during the Q&A part of this session. You've told us more about the violation, Ragda, and the suffering of the families. And so this takes us to a different topic, which is that these violations and the price that is being paid by the victims and their families. But the next step is how we can deal with that. And this is what leads us to the second topic, which is TJ enforced disappearances in Yemen, which will be presented by Dr. Al-Ubaid Ahmed Al-Ubaid, who is he was a PhD in international law. He's an associate professor at Georgetown and a member of the advisory board of the Canadian Legal Board. He's also an expert on justice and human rights. Until the end of 2023, he was a senior advisor at the UN the UN Commission for Labor Rights, and he also worked in the commission in Yemen. Welcome, Dr. Al-Ubaid. After Ragda's initial intervention on the reality that the victims of enforced disappearance have been facing and the impact that this violation has on their societies and their families, we wanted to hear from you on what were the ways to resolve this issue and how transitional justice can preserve the rights of the victims and ensure
شكرا
non-repetition.
قبول
Over to you,
وتحية
Dr.
لكل
Labaid. Thank you very much,
المشاركين
Qabul.
بس لو سمحت لي تحية
I
خاصة
would like to
لأختي
welcome all of the
مشهور
panelists, but also
سعدت
specifically
اسمها بين
Houria
الحضور
Mashhour. I saw that her name was
وزميلة
among
عزيزة
the attendees.
وكان لي
She's
الشرف إنه
a very
اشتغلت
close
معها فترات
colleague, and
طويلة في
I
اليمن
was honored to work with her for a very long time in Yemen.
أنا الحقيقة قبول حاختصر كثير لأنه
Qabul, I'll be as brief as possible because I think the presentation, the previous presentation has already covered a lot of things. I will focus on three things that I think are important when we discuss enforced disappearance and transitional justice. The first topic
هي الفترات
is
الزمنية
the duration or the
اللي ممكن
time
عن
frame
خلالها نحن نتعرض لمشاكل الاختفاء القسري.
during which we can look through.
خليني هنا أمشي
Let's go.
لل
Sorry, let me just go to the correct
عندنا لو
slide.
افتكر يعني يمكن 5
I
فترات
remember,
أساسية
based on what I remember, there are
يحددوا
5
محددا
main
من ناحية
periods in Yemen's
تشريع
history that are
القانون،
going
لكن
to
أيضا
be
من الناحية
contentious when it
العملية
comes to
بنساعد
the
على
legislation and
الانتقالية،
also when it comes to the
والناس اللي
practical
كانوا
steps of
شغالين على
transitional
عملية
justice.
الانتقالية بعد الثورة بتاعت
The people that were
2011
working
هي
on
الملفات
transitional justice
الاختيارية.
after 2011, after the
في
revolution, know
ملفات
about this
المختفين
problem. With
غسريا
regards to the files of the
قبل
forcibly
الوحدة
disappeared, there were files of
اللي
those who had
هي
been forcibly
يعني في
disappeared
ملفات
before
كثيرة جدا ما
unification of
زالت
Yemen. There are
مفتوحة
still many files
من قبل
that have not been resolved from
1990.
before
هذه الفترة
1990.
بتشمل
And this
الأحداث
period
المؤسفة
includes the
بتاعت
unfortunate
86
events in
والأحداث اللي
1986
تمت
in the
أيضا في
south,
الشمال
and also
من
the events
62 في
in the
فترات
north
كثيرة
from
من ضمنها
1962 on,
السبعينات في مختفين
including the period of
غفريا
the 1970s, during
وأرقام
which there were many
أو أسماء ما
forcibly
زالت
disappeared,
تدرج
and names
في بعض القوائم
that
إلى
are
يومنا
still
هذا.
included
فهذه
in
هي
the
الفترة
lists of the
الأولى.
forcibly disappeared even until
الفترة
today. So this is
الثانية
the
هي
first
من
period. The
90
second period
لحد
is from
94 وهي فترة
1990
الوحدة
to
اليمنية
1994. This is the period of
وخاصة
Yemeni
ما
unification
تبعها من تصفيات
and the
سياسية
political
وبيكون أيضا
reprisals that occurred
هنالك بعض
afterwards. And
الحالات
there might
الاختفاء
also be
القسري.
some cases of enforced disappearance from this period.
طبعا الفترة أيضا بتاعت
There's also the period in
1994
1994 during the Civil
واكب
War,
أيضا عملية واسعة من الاختفاءات
during which there
القسرية
were widespread
بعد
disappearances that were linked
الحرب
to
الأهلية.
the war in 1994.
أنا جبت هنا فترة الحروب
I
الأولى بتاع
also
صعدة
included
بس طبعا
the
ما عنديش أي
initial wars in
معلومات،
Sa'da, and I
لكن
don't have any clear information
سمعت
on
في
them,
بعض
but I
الأحيان
heard in
إنه
many
يقال إنه
cases
هنالك
that
بعض الاختفاء
there were
القسرية.
cases of individuals who had been
وفي الفترة
forcibly
اللي هي
disappeared during this
فترة
period. And then
الثورة
there is
في
the period
2011
of the revolution in
هنالك بعض الأسماء
2011.
ما زالت
There are still some
مخفية.
individuals who have been
وعندنا
forcibly disappeared
أخيرا
and
فترة
whose fates
الصراع
have yet to be
اللي هي
revealed.
من
And finally, we have the period
2014
of the conflict from
إلى يومنا هذا.
2014 until today.
هذه طبعا بذكر
I would
الحضور
like to remind our
إنه
audience
إشكالية العدالة
that the problem
الانتقالية
with
خاصة في
transitional
اليمن
justice, and especially
إن
in
تحديد
Yemen,
الفترة
is in
الزمنية
determining the time
حيتعاطى معها
frame
موضوع العدالة
that
الانتقالية.
the transitional justice process will cover.
الإشكالية
The
الكبرى في
main
موضوع
issue
الاختفاء الغسري إنها هي جريمة
with enforced
مستمرة
disappearance
في
is
تاريخ
that it
اليمن،
is a crime or violation that has
وأي تعامل
continued
مع
throughout Yemen's
فترات
modern history.
حيخلق
And when we
إشكالية
try to
إنه
set the time frames,
الفترات
this will cause a
الأقدم
problem because the
لم يتم
previous
التناول
periods
في الحالات اللي فيها
and the
ولم يتم
cases that
معالجة
arose from them have not been dealt
تناولها.
with
فأنا بعتقد إنه ده
if
سؤال
we set
كبير
a time
جدا
frame excluding them. And this is a
لليمنيين
very important and
إنه
major
حتى
question for
إذا اختاروا
Yemenis,
مثلا
that
فترة
even if they
التعاطي مع
choose,
الحرب
for
الأخيرة
example, to only cover the
يراعوا
period
مسألة إنه في
of
جرائم
the
من النوع
current war,
المستمر
we need to take
زي
into
الاختفاء
account that there
الغسري
are
المفروض يكون عندها
continuing
معالجات خاصة
crimes
بصورة
like enforced
استثنائية
disappearance
للفترات
that would need
الزمنية.
exceptional
هذا من ناحية من ناحية
solutions. And
سياسات
this is
ومن
when it
ناحية
comes to the
أيضا
policies and
يعني
also when it
إحقاق
comes
الحق،
to
لأنه
doing
كثير
what
من
is right.
الأحيان
Because in many
أنا
cases,
بتذكر
and I'll remember
كان كثير من
in
النقاشات
many of the
وكنت أتمنى
discussions,
يكون
and I had
معنا
hoped that
القاضي هلال
Judge Hal
القرشي.
Qirshi would have been here with us
كان
today, but
قضية
the
اختفاء
issue,
والدة من
her father's
أعتقد
disappearance, for example,
78.
from 1978, I believe,
لما
if
الناس
I'm correct.
تحصر النقاش
When
مثلا
people
في
limit the
فترة
discussion to
2011 هذا كان هو
2011,
النقاش
this was
بتاع
the same
الجباية الحربية في
discussions that
اليمن
were already
إنه
undertaken
الإخضاع
on
الكاسح
transitional
حتى
justice in Yemen, that from
سنة من
2011, sorry, from
1990 لحد
1990 to
2011 هذا
2011,
هذا الاختراع
that
كان
this
قبل
was the
الحرب.
proposal for a time frame to be covered by transitional justice before the
فالحالات
war.
هذه كيف يتم
But
التعامل
cases like
معها؟
this of somebody who was
هذه النقطة
forcibly disappeared in
الأولى أنا
1978, how
بفكر
would we
إنها
deal with it? And I
تحتاج
think this is the
لنقاش
first point that
متعمق.
would need more in-depth
النقطة
discussion to
الثانية اللي
resolve.
عاوز أتعرض
The
لها
second point that I wanted to
هي
mention
مسألة الأرقام.
is the topic of the numbers.
مسألة الأرقام إنه كم عدد
When
المختفين
we talk about
الغسريين
the
في
numbers of how
اليمن
many
على
people have been
مختلف
forcibly
الفترات اللي أنا
disappeared in
ذكرتها
Yemen during all
مسألة
of the
مشكلة
different stages that I
لأسباب
mentioned, this
كثيرة.
would not
السبب
be an easy
الأول
issue to
إنه
determine
كثير من
for several
المنظمات
reasons. The first
تستخدم
reason is that many
طرق
organizations use
ومناهج مختلفة
different ways to
لتقصي الحقائق
calculate and
والحصر
to uncover
عدد
the truth and to
الأشخاص.
determine the number of
عشان كده
individuals
بنلقى
who have been harmed.
الأرقام
That is why
أحيانا
at
تبدو
times we'll
مثلا
find
لو نظرنا الأرقام
different
الفريق
figures. If
العام
we
بتاع
look at
الأمم
the
المتحدة
figures
في
from
مجال
the
الاختفاء
UN's
الغسري
team working on enforced
تتفاجأ
disappearance, you
بأن
might be
الأرقام
surprised
تكاد تكون يعني
to
ضئيلة.
find that these
فمثلا
statistics are much less than
يعني
statistics from other
في
sources.
حالات التقرير اللي
And so,
بدأ
for
في
example,
98 و
in the
99
reports
كان في 98 حالة.
in
في
1998, there were
2008 كان في
99
37
report, there
حالة.
were 98 cases. In
في
2008, there were 73 outstanding cases in 2014, in the beginning of the conflict, until 2021, there were only 14 cases that were attributed to Sanaa, and the report from 2023 documented 19 cases to Sanaa. But there are accumulated files or cases that long-standing files, but this is just an example of the differences in statistics. The organizations operating in Yemen, the number of cases that they've documented from the beginning of the war in 2014 until 2023 is 1,186 cases. And these are not the UN statistics. These are the statistics by organizations that are operating in Yemen. In comparison, Amnesty International estimated 1,547 cases, and this is what I'm trying to say, that it's important for us to rethink this issue, and for there to be serious work to reach an agreement on clear guidelines for the numbers and the cases. The first challenge is going to be how to deal with the time frame for the cases that will be reviewed by a transitional justice process, and the second is dealing with these statistics. Like I've said, there are cases from 1962, from 1972 and 78, and there are cases that are still outstanding from this period. And so this is the second point.
ذكرت المعايير وأنا بأمن على الاقتراح.
I also reiterate the proposal by Ulfat that it is important for Yemen to ratify the for the Convention on Enforced Disappearance. The Yemeni legal system, unfortunately, does not criminalize enforced disappearance. And this is one of the points that anyone working on this issue will have faced or dealt with. So, for example, if there's a person who has been forcibly disappeared for 20 or 30 years, and the family of this victim resort to the courts,
فقط المطالب حقوق عادية من الدولة أو من بعض الخدمات بيطالبوهم بشهادة وفاة.
and they ask, for example, for a death certificate to be issued, or for them to be able to announce that this individual has been missing for decades so that they can move on with their civil affairs. And this is still a significant problem for the families of the victims of enforced disappearance.
بالعكس هم بيسعوا لإثبات الحقيقة ولإيجاد المختفي غثريا، لكن المطالبة
But even the demanding them to go to courts and to get death certificates issued as if this was a normal case of someone who had been missing, for example, for a very long time, that these would be the legal procedures that were followed. But it is unfair to ask the families of those who've been forcibly disappeared to follow the same process.
تبدأ في التسلسل أو التعامل. فأنا بعتقد
And so I believe that the issue of ratifying the Enforced Disappearance Convention is important, or at least that Yemeni laws clearly criminalize enforced disappearance so that justice can take its course. And with regards to the third topic, which is how to deal with how transitional justice deals with the topic of enforced disappearance. The first topic is, or the first point is, that there would need to be a formal entity that is formed, a formal commission or a body that is tasked with dealing with the issues of enforced disappearance. And like I've said, because these crimes have been ongoing for a very long time and would need additional focus for them to be dealt with. And so this is an important point, that we should not leave this for the support that civil society organizations can provide. There would need to be clear documentation efforts that would help contribute to resolving these issues. And the second practical step, and this is still dealing with the issue of statistics, that it's important to create a national registry of cases of enforced disappearance. There are many organizations that are working on this file, but they all have their different methodologies, which might lead to conflicting statistics or figures. And there might be, for example, mixing between enforced disappearance and missing individuals, or enforced disappearance and individuals who have been killed. And so it's important to create a comprehensive national registry for these cases that allows organizations to work with it based on a specific methodology, so that we could have at least a form of central level coordination for issues of enforced disappearance. In addition to these points, when it comes to cases of enforced disappearance, It's important for there to be mechanisms to identify the missing individuals. There might come a period, for example, when some mass graves might be found for the graves of individuals who have been forcibly disappeared. And so it's important for there to be the forensic capacities and an attempt to carry out DNA identification programs to identify. This is a very technical and specialized field that is directly linked to the topic of enforced disappearance. The fourth topic within the programs of transitional justice, it needs to take into account the issues of reparations for the victims and the families of those who have been forcibly disappeared. And just like in normal cases of transitional justice, it will be providing financial, symbolic, and psychosocial support for the victims and the families. And the fifth point is to explicitly criminalize enforced disappearance in Yemen's national laws. And I believe that the easiest way to achieve this would be to ratify the convention. But in the absence of that, for there to be an amendment to the Yemen's penal code to explicitly criminalize this violation. The sixth point is to integrate enforced disappearance cases into peace and transitional justice negotiations. At times, this topic gets lost within the topic of prisoner exchange or issues that are more, for example, the exchange of bodies. But I believe that it is important for a part of our focus to be on dealing with these issues practically during peace negotiations, to have a point specifically on the enforced disappearance or those who have been forcibly disappeared. The seventh point, and it's also focuses on transitional justice in the broader sense, that any transitional justice efforts cannot be accepted morally if they do not include the victims and victims' families' participation in all stages of transitional justice. And this is why we mention this point here, ensuring victims and families' participation in all transitional justice processes. And the final point is reforming security and judicial institutions to guarantee non-repetition. And definitely Yemenis might know the best way to achieve this. And this might be one of the biggest challenges in Yemen. As destructive as the war has been to infrastructure and to the economy, there has been an almost complete destruction of judicial institutions and security institutions as well, meaning that the groundwork for justice might be difficult to provide. I hope that I didn't take too long with my intervention, Qabool, but this was just a summary of these points. I would like to leave it here, and when we take the questions during the question and answer session, we might clarify some important points. Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Ubaid. You've helped provide many important points and many different mechanisms that can be used to resolve enforced disappearance under transitional justice processes that include civil society, the state, and many other different actors. And I reiterate to the participants that any questions you might have, you can submit in the question and answer box. Dr. Al-Ubaid, you also mentioned some of the statistics that local civil society organizations in Yemen have worked on. And this takes us to the next point, which is the real efforts of including the victims and the families of the victims, as well as the civil society organizations. And we've seen this from many different activists and civil society as a whole. So let's move on to the second aspect, which focuses on the efforts of civil society organizations. This topic will be covered by Ulfat Al-Rifai, who is a human rights activist, a graduate of law and college, and she works on documentation at the Abductees Mothers Association, has been in this position since 2016. She is also a family member of a victim and one of the survivors of this violation. Ulfat, let's start with your own experience as someone who has survived and from a family of one of the victims. Based on your own experience, how has this experience shaped your own struggle and your perspective, and also the work that you do with civil society to advocate for these issues? And how do you view the contributions of civil society organizations to raise the voice of victims and to achieve acknowledgement or recognition for this violation? Thank you very much, Qabul. I would like to thank you for moderating. I would like to thank the organizers of this session, the Yemen Peace Forum and the Sanaa Center. for giving me this opportunity to talk about this very important topic.
سأتحدث
I
كناجية
will speak as a survivor
تعرضت للانتهاك
who has
من
been
قبل
subject
جماعة
to a
الحوثي
violation by the
وعملية
Houthis
النشاطية الحقوقي في رابطة الضباط
due to
المتطوعين.
my work on
طبعا
human rights
كنا في
issues in the
وقفة
Abductees Mothers
احتجاجية
Association. We
أمام
were in a
المجموعة
protest
في إحدى
in front
المحافظات،
of a
وبعد الانتهاء من
governorate authority
هذه الوقفة
building, and after
الاحتجاجية في
ending
كل
this
المطار
demonstration, during
بخروج
which we
أبناء
had asked for
المثقفين مقابل
the
خروج
release of
أخواننا
our
وأزواجنا،
brothers
كثير من
and
الأمهات
children. There were
والزوجات
many mothers and
والأبناء
wives there
المختطفين
and
نطلب
family members of the
الإخوان
abductees
طلبناهم
who were
خروج
there in this.
المختطفين من سجون جماعة الحوثي. وبعد الانتهاء من الوقفة
And after ending our
الاحتجاجية تحركت
protest,
أنا وإحدى
I,
زميلاتي
along with one of my
وسط غرفة،
colleagues,
فوجئنا
went a short distance
بمسلحين
away when we were surprised to find
كانت
armed men
أعمارهم ما بين
whose ages
12 إلى
ranged between
13 عاما،
12 to
مسلحين
14 years of
يطالبوا
age,
بالعودة
and
إلى
they were
غرفة
asking us
المحافظة لأجل الجلوس
demanding that we
مع
go back
الموجودين
to the
بالمنطقة.
governorate building to meet with the deputy governor.
أنا وزميلتي شعرنا
My colleague and I
بالخوف
were afraid at that
وكدنا تعرض
point. We
للتوقيف
were afraid that we
ونتعرض
would be
للاحتجاز،
detained or,
فأوقفنا باص
and,
أحد
and so we
الباصات في
stopped a
الشارع
bus on the street
وتحركنا، ولكن
and
فجأة
tried to leave.
كنا في
And while
الباص
we were on the bus,
لاحظت سيارة
I noticed that
بيضاء
there was a white vehicle
تراقبنا
that was
من
following
خلف
us.
الباص. فتكلمت مع صاحب
And so I
الباص
spoke
لأنه
with the bus
حكينا
driver.
إن الطريق التي تؤدي إلى
We were on a
السوق
road
لا
to
حدث
the
فيها
market,
شيء.
and I thought that if something
تكلمنا
would,
مثلا إن كنا الناس الموجودين
that
في
maybe
السوق
people in the
يمكنهم
market
مساعدتنا.
would help us and not allow this
في
to
تلك
happen.
اللحظة
But
شعرت
at that
بالخوف
moment,
شديد.
I was
أول
very,
مرة
very
وصلنا
afraid.
في
As soon as we arrived,
كل الفتحة التي تؤدي إلى
as soon
السوق،
as we arrived in
فوجئنا
the entrance to the
بقائد
market, we were
مسلح
surprised with an armed
يمكن
vehicle
10 أشخاص
with around
مسلحين بزي
10
عسكري.
armed
كانوا يضربون أول شيء
individuals
من
on it.
خلف الباص،
First, they stopped behind
وصاحب
the
السيارة
bus,
البيضاء الذي كان يقول
and the
لها
driver of
لهذه
the white vehicle that had
ضروري
been
أنه
behind us,
يتم القبض عليها.
they
يعني لما سمعت إنه يتم القبض عليها شعرت بخوف أكثر.
they said that
فكان
their
طلبهم
orders were to arrest us, and they
أعطونا
asked us
الكاميرا
to give
وكل التليفون
them
التي
our
احتفظنا
cameras
فيها.
and the
يعني
phones
كانوا
that we had been
يحرصون
using.
بالجانب
They
الإعلامي
were
أن
afraid of any
يعرض
videos or media
الانتهاك مع
coverage of the
الحوثي.
violations that were being
تكلمت
committed
قلت
by the
هم لا
Houthis.
يمكنون عنا لا
I told them
تليفون
that we didn't
ولا
have any
كاميرا.
phones, we didn't have any
فدخل
cameras,
أحد العساكر
and so one
بجانب
of
صاحب
the
الباص
armed men
والآخر
went onto the bus,
دخل بجانب
and the
وقال لي
others
زميلتي.
sat down in front of
ألفت
me and my
بعدين
colleague.
بس
I'm sorry, Ulfat.
كأنه في عندك
It
دوشة
seems like there's
شوية.
a lot of noise where you are. We can't hear you clearly.
أيوة. معلش.
Sorry about that. I apologize. Let's continue.
فعندما دخل أحد
And
العساكر
so
وجلس
when
بجانبي
one
أنا
of the armed
وزميلتي
men
كان
got
تحت
onto the
السؤال
bus and
هل
sat next to
يعطونا
us, he asked
يعطونا
us to give
الكاميرا التي
them
بحوزتنا.
our
نحن لا
phones
نتمكن
and
من
cameras.
رؤية
And like
لا
I said, our
تليفون ولا
response is that
كاميرا.
we did not have any cameras or phones.
أردت أن أصرخ يعني عشان اللي في السوق
And I wanted to
والناس
start to draw
يسمعونا
attention so that the people in
ويساعدونا.
the market could
على
hear or
طول
see what was going
أحد
on and helping us. But
اللي كانوا
then one of
بجانبنا
the
رفع
soldiers
سلاحه
there raised
وجد
their
الفوق
weapon,
تكلمت
pointed it
فيه
at my
وضرب
forehead, and he
رصاصة.
said, if you say anything, I
سمعتهم
will
قلت
shoot
خلاص
you.
صار
And then I heard
الانتهاك
them, okay, let's
الجماعي
take them to
وقفنا
the criminal
قريب يعني
investigation
كان من
department.
صرفنا الطق
And
أمام
while we were
سيارة
going there, there
بيضاء.
was the
في
white
تلك
vehicle was in
اللحظة
front of
كنت
us, and the
أفكر
military vehicle was driving behind our bus.
كيف
And
الوصول
at the
للخبر
time, I was thinking about how we can get
لوالدتي
this
مع أن والدتي
news to
كانت
my father and mother,
تعبانة
because
كثير لأنها
even
تعرضت
despite the fact that my
لاختطاف.
mother
يعني
was very
عندما
sick,
أو تعرضت
she
يعني
had a
لمرض
stroke
شديد وأدخلنا
and was
إلى
very
المستشفى
sick
بعد اختطاف أبي.
after the abduction of my
فكنت
brother.
في تلك المسافات
And so
أفكر
during that
في
distance,
إيش
I was
يصير
thinking
لأطفال
about what
إيش
would happen
يحصلون.
to my
أثناء
mother,
الطريق
what this would
حاولت
do
إني
to them.
أفتح
And
بوابة
during
الباص
our trip there, I
وأخرج
tried to
أحد
open the door of the bus and
المتحمس
to
علينا.
escape, but I was
وصلنا
hit by
إلى قرب من
assaulted by
مبنى
one of
البحث
the
الجنائي.
armed men.
وصلت
When we
هناك
arrived near the
وزميل مخبرية
CID,
انتظرت
there were
في
two
البوابة.
female police
وكنت
officers
وأخذ
waiting for us
زميلتي
at the
وتنفسنا
entrance. They took
بشكل
me and my
ممهج
colleague and they
يعني
searched us
بشكل مهين لمدة
in a
نصف
way that was
ساعة. ثم
humiliating for half
دخلنا
an
إلى غرفة
hour. And then
التحقيق
they took
وتم
us into an
التحقيق معنا
interrogation
بشكل
room, after
ممهج.
which we were
يعني
interrogated
كان
at
المحقق
length, and the
يصرخ
interrogator
ويسب
would yell at
ويشتم
us, he would
لماذا يتم
curse us,
خروجنا
he
لماذا
would
نضاهي
he
ماذا
was asking us why we
نطالب
were
به خروج
demanding these things. And I
أهالينا
told them that we
المسلمين.
were demanding the release of our relatives from
فظلينا
prison.
ساعات
We
في
spent
تحت
hours
التحقيق
under
وتحت التدريب
interrogation and
حتى
under threats
جاء أحد
until
الجواسيس
one
أو
of my
المخبر بعد ما
brothers
تواصلت.
came.
قلت يعني أتمنى إنه ما يعرف
And
أبي
I'd hoped that
أو
my
أمي
father would not
واتصلنا على
find out
الموعد.
what had happened to me, but I was able to get the
فكنا نتعهد
news
إنه ما
to
نخرج
our family,
لنشارك في مثل
and they
هذه
made us leave
الأنشطة
after signing a
لإقامة
commitment
خروج
that we would not
المختطفين.
participate in any activities
بعد خروجنا
demanding the
من هناك
release of abductees.
حصلت لي صدمة.
After leaving, I was in shock. I think maybe I spent maybe a week or more. I wasn't even able to eat anything. to the point where
أصبت بمرض شديد
I got
وفي تلك
very
اللحظة
ill.
يعني عرفوا
And at
أهلي
that time,
ومنعوني من
my
العمل
family
في
discovered what had
إدارة
happened.
مجتمعات
They
الموظفين
prohibited me from working at the
وأخذوني إلى
Abductees
البيت
Mothers
لمدة ثلاثة
Association. They took
أسبوع
me home and I
لكن
spent
كانت
around a
فترة
week there,
صعبة
but it was a
جدا
very,
وكنت
very
أفكر
difficult period
ماذا
for me.
يحدث لأهالي
And I was
المعتقل
thinking
في
about what
وسائل
was
التواصل الذين
happening
يتم
to the
اضطهاد
families of the
أهاليهم
victims,
يكونوا
those
في
who are
السجون لسنوات
abducted
وشهور لا
and
يعلمون عنه
forcibly
شيء
disappeared
يعني
for
أنا في ساعات
months or
فكرت
years. For me,
كيف
it was just
أصبحت
a few
حالتي
hours,
وكيف
and I
أصبحت
saw what
حالة
impact
هاي
this had not
المعتقلين
just on me, but on my family.
طبعا
And I can't
هم
imagine
في
others.
خطر
Sorry,
والفت اسمحي
Ulfat,
لي
if you'll allow me,
انطلاقا من الحديث
based
اللي بتكلمي
on
انت وعنه
what you
هذه
said about
التجربة
your own personal
كيف
experience with
كان
this,
دور المجتمع
what was the role
الذي
of civil
عاصرت هذه
society
القضايا؟ أيش
in
اشتغل المجتمع
advocating for
الذي
these
تطرق
cases?
مع
What
أهالي
work has
الضحايا
civil
وعاصرت
society
هذه
done with the
القضايا؟ كيف
families
ممكن
of the
ندخل
victims to
يعني
try
كيف
to
ممكن نناقش هذا الدور؟
play a role in this? And how can we better discuss this
جهود
role?
منظمات
The role of
المجتمع
civil
المدني
society
بشكل عام
organizations in
والمنظمات
general,
التي يديهم من التوجيه ورصد
their
عمليات
role
جمع
is in
شهادات
documenting and in
المعتقلين
collecting the
والإفراج
statements
عنهم
of the families
من
of the
خلال
victims and
إعداد
those who have
دلائل
been
وهي
released
تعرض على
to
الرأي العام
present
والمنظمات الدولية
reports that can
حسب
be
مجلس
presented
الأمن
to the
الإنساني وفريق
public
الخبراء
opinion and to
الدولي
the
وكذلك من
international
خلال
community,
المناصرة والضغط
and also through
بإجراء توجيه
advocacy
وندوات
and
احتجاجية
lobbying,
وحملات
through
إعلامية
protests
محلية
and
ودولية
demonstrations, and also
وإرسال
local
رسائل
and
للمتوجهات إلى
regional
المسؤولين
international
والمنظمات
campaigns,
الحقوقية
and
الدولية.
also being in contact with the
ثالثا من
Security
خلال
Council
الدعم
and
النفسي
international and
والاجتماعي
regional
وهي
organizations.
تقديم
Third is
برامج
by
دعم
providing
نفسي لأهالي
psychosocial support
المختطفين
to
وخاصة
the
النساء
victims and the
والأطفال
families of the victims,
وبناء
especially women
شبكات
and children,
تضامن
and building
مجتمعي في
solidarity
الأعباء
networks
الاقتصادية على
to
الأسر.
help decrease the
رابعا
burden on
وهي
the families. The
مبادرات
fourth point
المجتمعية
is
مبادرات
through
المصالحة
community
المجتمعية
initiatives,
وإقرار
initiatives for
سراح بعض
community
المحتجزين عبر
reconciliation and
الوساطات
securing the
الدولية
release of
والاجتماعية
abductees through tribal
وتطوير
and social
كوادر شبابية
mediators,
وحقوقية
and
على آلية
training
الرصد والتوثيق
youth
والمناصرة.
on the
ثالثا
mechanisms of
إذا
documentation
تكلمنا
and
عن دور
advocacy.
الرابطة
And also, if we
بشكل
talk about the role of the
خاص
association
تأسيس الرابطة
specifically, the
منظمات
Abductees
الطرفين
Mothers
في العام
Association was established in
2016 وبدأ
2016,
فريقها
and its
بالرصد
team
وتوثيق
started
حالات
to work to
التسجيل
document the
لأن العمل
cases
الحقوقي الصحي
of
يجب أن
enforced
يستند إلى
disappearance.
الرصد
And it's
والتوثيق
important for this
واستنادا
process
إلى
to be
بيانات الرصد والتوثيق لدى
completed
الرابطة
soundly.
فإن حالات
And based
الإسقاط
on the
القسري
statistics
المسجولة
and documentation
بلغت
that at the Abductees Mothers
1196
Association,
لدى
we have
جماعة الحوثي
1,196
و130 لدى
by the
جنود
Houthis,
الشرطة الإقليمي الجنوبي و40
190
لدى
with the
الحكومة المعترف
SDC, and
بها
40 with the
و18 لدى
internationally
القوات
recognized
المسلحة
government,
في
and
الساحل
18
الغربي.
with the
هذا
joint
فقط ما يتم
forces
رصده
on the West
وتوثيقه
Coast. And these
لدى
are just the
الرابطة
cases that
شك
have
أن
been
العالم في
documented
الواقع
by the
له
Abductees
كثير
Mothers
ما
Association. And
سنتابعه
I'm sure that the
مجتمعا.
statistics are much
لقد
higher than
كانت
the figures we
العاملات
mentioned
في
here.
الرابطة سندا
The
للأمهات
women working at the
والضحايا
Abductees
حين
Mothers
يتم
Association
إرهاقهن
have been
بمضايقات والتحرش
have
أحيانا
bين
بالبحث
support
عند
of
بحثهن
the
عن
families
أحبائهن
and the
فكلنا
mothers of the
نتسارع
victims.
في رحلات البحث لحمايتهن من أي
And we
مضايقات.
would
كما
go with them
قامت
on these
الرابطة
visits to ensure
بتقديم
that they would
الدعم
not be harassed.
النفسي
The Abductees
لذوي
Mothers
الضحايا من
Association has also
النساء
provided
والأطفال
psychosocial
ولكن
support for the
تحتاج هذا
families of the
لكل فئة.
victims, but this was not an
ففي
easy
أحد
process to
الاستبيانات
undergo. And
التي
one of the
نشرتها رابطة
surveys
أمهات
conducted
المختطفين
by the
حول
AMA
الآثار التي
on the
تصاب
impact
باللاجئين الذين تعرضوا
on
لفترات
those who have
الاختفاء
survived,
القسري
those who have been
وكان
forcibly
المدعين بقول
disappeared and then released.
36 من
And this
الناجين
was
كان
made up of a
منهم
sample of 36 survivors.
55% يميلون
55%
للعزلة
said
والانطواء
that they were very isolated and
و47%
did not
يشعرون
want to be around other
بحقوقهم
people,
وكانوا
and
يراقبون
47% said that they
وكأنهم
were
ضحية
in
و50%
constant fear
يعانون من
and felt that they
اضطرابات
were under surveillance.
من اضطرابات. ضغط
50%
على
also
أفراد
had
الرابطة من
psychological issues.
المماولات في
And the
سبيل
team of the
القضية على
Abductees
الإيصال
Mothers
والصحة والرفاهية
Association has worked to
لذويهم
ensure that the
عبر
voices
الوقفات
of the victims
الاحتجاجية
and the
فعبرنا
relatives will be conveyed
أعرضنا للإعتاء
through the
والضرب
demonstrations in
والاحتجاز في
which they
بعض
were
هذه
assaulted
الوقفات
and
كما
attacked and even
قصرنا
detained in some
العلاقات
of these
العاجلة في حالات
demonstrations.
الاختفاء
And we also
وحالات
issue
الاختفاء
statements
والبيانات والتقارير السنوية والنموذج إنني
also
تناولت
and also
بعض
regular
الأمثلة.
and annual reports on these violations. I'm sorry, Ulf.
أستمر؟
Hey, should I continue? Yes, yes.
باقي
I
دقيقة.
just wanted to let you know that you had a minute left.
اكملي باقي معك
Go ahead.
دقيقة.
I just wanted to let you know that you had a minute left for your intervention. Okay, thank
على
you.
سبيل المثال أصدرت
So,
رابطة
for
أمهات
example, the
المختطفين في
AMA has
جنوار
issued a
الموقع
report
بالسودان عن
on
سجن حنيش الذي كان
the
يمنع
black hole, which
المحتجزين
is the
فيه
Hunesh
من
prison,
التواصل
where
مع
detainees
عائلاتهم
were not allowed
وزياراتهم
to
سواء
communicate
بعد
or to
إصدار
get visits
التقرير.
from their families. And after
كان
issuing the
هناك
report,
تحفيز بوسائل
this
الإعلام من
encouraged
الحديث
the
عن هذا
media
السجن
to
وممارسة
address
الضغط على جماعة
this
الحوثي التي
prison and the
سمحت
practices
لاحقا
being
بزيارة
used in unit by the Houthis, after which the families of the victims were allowed to visit their detained relatives. And we also saw that there was a marked improvement in the areas of detentions where the duration of the enforced disappearance was decreased. And we also pressured some of these actors to provide reparations. There are recommendations that I wanted to propose very quickly at the end that we still we still call upon the Yemeni government to ratify the Convention on Enforced Disappearance and to ensure that Yemeni legislation is in line with these international agreements and conventions. It's also important for the government to issue a commission to find the fate of the forced disappearance, to support the victims, and to ensure non-repetition of the enforced disappearance, and to develop the capacities of researchers and monitors and civil society organizations so that they can document these violations based on the methodologies used by the United Nations. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ulfat. Thank you very much for telling us about your own personal experience and how this has been reflected in the work that you do in civil society. Because at the end of the day, these experiences that we face do not hinder us from advocating for these cases, but actually encourage us to continue to support the victims and their families, because we sense what they are going through. And I think you were all in agreement. All of our panelists were mentioning, for example, the ratification of the convention and also the importance of forming a national commission to coordinate efforts. Let me start with a round of questions. We'll also get some of the questions that were presented in the question and answer box. We'll go back to you, Raghda. Raghda, in your opinion, what makes the crime of enforced disappearance different from other severe violations in Yemen? And what makes it more complicated when it comes to documenting and resolving it? We mentioned some of the solutions, but what makes these kinds of cases more complicated to document and deal with? In a minute, if you can, please. With regards to enforced disappearance, I think because it is a series of complex violations. And I think this is why we can say that this is the most dangerous of these kinds of violations. But the difficulties that many face today, we were in a workshop where everyone was talking about this topic, and it is the issue that, so for example, like some of our colleagues, the personnel of civil society organizations, one of the challenges is that the families of these victims refuse to participate in the documentation, do not want these to document. If in civil society, the families of civil society workers want these cases not to be documented because they were promised that if they do not speak about it, the victim will be released, or because they are threatened and they are told that if you start to write about this crime on social media, there will be more threats and that the victim will be tortured. At times they get reports, for example, it's true that the families, that they do not know where the detainees are being held, but they also hear that their relative who is in detention is being tortured during their enforced disappearance. And so these complications that we face, and also while working to gather the case files, one of the problems we face is the lack of evidence. So for example, I work on the National Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations, and the idea is that we submit case files to the judiciary, and these case files would need to be complete. But because it is difficult to gather some of this evidence, it makes it difficult for us to submit these case files to the judiciary. And the same thing applies also to the reports that we provide because of the lack of evidence in these case files. I think the Abductees Mothers Association has been able to submit many case files. It is an entity that has worked very closely with the families of the victims. But this violation or this crime in Yemen continues to be very dangerous, first and foremost because there is no clear and explicit criminalization of enforced disappearance. And like we've said, Yemen has not ratified that convention. Thank you. Thank you very much, Raghda. I had a question to Dr. Al-Ubaid and the intervention that he made. A number of questions came to mind. Dr. Al-Ubaid, in transitional justice, the issue of enforced disappearance has always been one of the most complex files to deal with because it requires reparations, accountability, and also truth, or for the truth to be revealed. In your perspective, what needs to be the priority for these issues in order to provide justice to the victims and also ensure? I had asked for. I should get 2 additional minutes because I finished before my time during the intervention. But regarding your question,
لسؤالك
Or before answering
حورية
your question,
ذكرتني في
Huria
الشات
mentioned me in the
كان
chat. She mentioned that,
في زمن
or
الفترة
she reminded me that during the
الانتقالية
transitional
تقدم مشروع
period,
قانون للمصادقة على
there
الاتفاقية
was a draft
في
law to
في
ratify
الفترة
the
الانتقالية اللي هي
convention
بعد
in the
ثورة
transitional
2011 لكن
period after
البرلمان
2011,
لم
but the
يجد
parliament did
الاتفاقية
not
في جدول الأعمال
include this,
لسبب ما مش
but the
مش
parliament at the
مش
time
عام.
did not include it in its
لكن زي ما
agenda
أنا قلت
for some
بالنسبة
reason.
لسؤالك هو بيتعلق
And so I think
بكيف
that was a very
نعالج الموضوع
important
في
comment from Huria Mashur. But with regards to your question of how
العدالة
we can
الانتقالية
resolve this issue
صح
in transitional justice, correct?
أنا بعتقد إنه
I
لازم
believe that it is,
نعالج
we
مسألة
must
الظروف الأضرار المترتبة على اختيار الفترة
we must
الزمنية
first deal with the challenge of
أوكي
selecting the time frame.
الأولوية بتكون
But with
لأسنه
regards to the
لازم
priority, what
يتم
the priority is,
إيجاد
it is
سجل
important for there to be
للمختفين
a
غصبيا في اليمن على
registry of
مستوى هذه الفترات
individuals who have been enforcibly disappeared in Yemen
الحاجة
during these
الثانية
different
وهذا عمل
stages.
يمكن تقولوا
And the second
لجنة
priority, and this is work that can be done by
للتحقيق
the National
إنه
Commission
يكون
to
في جهة
investigate alleged violations
عندها
of human
اهتمام
rights, that there would
مختص
need to be
إما
an
تكون هي
entity
لجنة
that has
خاصة
a focus.
بحصر
It could be a
المختفين
a commission that
الغصبيين
is
أو
tasked with
تكون
documenting
هيئة عمل
enforced
خاصة
disappearance.
إنها تحصر هذه الأعداد لأن بقول لك
Because,
إنه
like I said earlier,
لما تجي العمل العدالة
when you actually work
الانتقالية
on transitional
بيختاروا
justice
الفترة
measures,
الزمنية
they will select the time frame.
إشكالية
But the
الفترة الزمنية
problem with the
تكون عندها
time
آثار
frame will be
مترتبة
that
ضارة
it will have a
على
negative impact
الاختفاء الغصبي
on the topic or the cases of
لأنها في
enforced
الغالب
disappearance. Because in
حتتعاطى
most
مع
cases, the
بحال
time
الاختفاء
frame will
الغصبي في
deal
الفترة
with
الزمنية
those who have
المحددة
been forcibly disappeared during
فأنا
that
بعتقد
specific
إنه
period.
يكون في
And
استثناء
so
لهذا
I think there
الموضوع
would need to be
بالنسبة
an
للاختفاء
exception
الغصبي
for
لابد أن يتم
for
الفصل
enforced disappearance in
بين
any
فترة
selection
زمنية
of a
اتفقوا
transitional
عليها حضرتك
justice
قلت
time frame,
تشمل
and to
الانتهاكات
ensure
الإنسانية
that
تمت في
they
86
include the
في
severe
الجنوب
gross
واللي تمت
violations that were
في
committed in
السبعينات اللي هي
1986 in the
أحداث
south
اليهيم اللي تمت
and
من
in the
62 في
1970s, also
الشمال
starting in
الحصر هنا على
1962 from
الأقل
the in the north.
السؤالين
And so limiting it to this time frame
الموضوع الثاني لما يكون
is
في
very
سجل
important.
بيكون
And
في
secondly,
انتظام
when there is
فما في
a
النهاية نحن
registry,
العدالة
this makes it
الانتقالية
more of
بالصورة
a
الاستثنائية
priority.
تتعاطى
And
مع
this does
الملف
not mean that
بصورة كلية كل
transitional
الفترة
justice cannot
الزمنية
deal with these files
وفي نفس
throughout
الوقت
all of the
إن هي
different time
فات
frames, while
تتحلى
at the same time
تتعاطى مع قضايا العدالة الانتقالية الأخرى
dealing with
بما
other issues of
مسألة الفترة
transitional
الزمنية
justice
بتاعت الحرب من
within the time
2014
frame. So, for
لحد
example, starting in
2025 نسأل الله إنه يحقق
2011
فيها
and
المكفين
2025.
هذه هي طبيعة العمل على
And
أساس
hopefully
إنه
that
بمعنى
the
لأنه
conflict
طبيعة
concludes,
الجريمة
because the nature of this
هكذا
violation is
الناس
very
يعني
dangerous.
مش هو الاختفاء
It's
الغصبي
not
فقط
just enforced disappearance.
المسألة هي عندها علاقة
It's
بأنه
related to
ال 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 الناس
the fact
في التمزيق
that this continues to tear the social fabric.
للنسيج الاجتماعي في في أشياء أنا بحطها لك في الشاشة بس
I'll
عشان الناس
present
تشوفها
something on the screen now just so
هي
people can
بتكون
see it.
مستمرة
These are
أنت
things that will
تخيل إنه هذه
continue. They will
الأشياء
not, the violations
تمزيق
will not,
النفسي
or the
الاجتماعي
impacts will not
في
stop.
أثر نفسي
So, for
واجتماعي
example,
عميق على
there
نفسية
is
الضحايا فما ذلك الصدمة
the
والإرهاق من الأحداث
psychological
دي
and so, an
ده
impact
بحيث
on the
إنه
social
هذه
fabric.
المسائل دي لازم يتم
And these issues, it's
التعامل معها
important
بطريقة
for these
شمولية في
issues to
الملف
be
هذا
dealt with
كصورة
comprehensively within this
استثنائية
file
للفترة
as an
الزمنية الخاصة
exception
بالعدالة
for the time
الانتقالية
frame that is
لأنه ده
selected for
حيكون مصدر
transitional
جدل كبير
justice,
جدا في الجهة
because this will be a very contentious topic when it is discussed in
شكرا
the.
لك يا
Thank you
أستاذ
very
دكتور.
much, Dr. Al-Ubaid.
برضه في مجموعة من الأسئلة
There were
بس
also a
خليني
number of
أنتقل أول شيء
questions that were presented, but I
للأستاذة
wanted first to
ألفت
hear
السؤال
from
قبل ما ننتقل
Ulfat or
للأسئلة
ask her a question before we move on to the questions
ألفت أنت أشرتي على
from the
الدور المنظمات
participants.
المجتمع
Ulfat, you
المدني
mentioned the
اللي بيكون
important role
فيها
of civil society
فسؤالي
organizations and how to
حتى
improve their
توصيتي من
efforts.
التوصيات
One of the
الحكومة بعد
recommendations that you
يعني
made
من
was to
خلال هذا
have social
الاقتراح
or
البعيد
community
ما هي
initiatives.
ما الذي
Based on your
نحتاجه هذه
perspective,
الجهود
what
لتتحول هذه
efforts do we
المبادرات
need to
المتفرقة
turn all of these
التي
disparate
المنظمات تعمل
initiatives?
لكن
Well, there are
كيف
many
يمكن أن
organizations
تتحول
working on
هذه
this, but how can
المبادرات
we ensure that
المتفرقة
all
إلى
of these
قوة ضغط
different
جامدة
initiatives
تحقق
will
نتائج
actually be
ملموسة
able
في تحقيق
to
الوضع
achieve
الإنساني؟
or to lobby for the result, for a tangible result? Ulfat, can you hear us? I don't know if Ulfat is still here.
أعتقد في مشكلة.
She seems to be having a problem with her internet.
أعتقد في عندها مشكلة في الإنترنت مش بتسمعني. خلينا ناخذ أسئلة
Okay,
من
let's take some more questions
المشاركين.
from
في
the
سؤال
participants.
لك
There
أستاذة
was a question to
من عبد
Raghda
العطابي.
by Abdul
كيف يمكن
Utabi.
تطبيق العدالة
How can
على
we
القوى
implement
المتصارعة
transitional
والكشف عن
justice on the warring
المختطفين؟
parties to ensure that
يا
we
ريت في
can
دقيقة.
reveal the fate of those who have been forcibly disappeared?
رغدة.
Raghda?
أسمعك عيدي السؤال.
I heard you, but can you please repeat the question?
كيف يمكن
The question
تطبيق
is how can
العدالة
we implement,
على القوى
how can we
المتصارعين
achieve
للكشف
justice with the warring
عن
parties
المختفين؟
to reveal the fate of those who've been
إحنا
forcibly
لازم
disappeared?
عشان نكشف أو نبدأ نبين ونرسم لمسار
For
العدالة
us to start on the
الانتقالية
transitional justice
كما ذكر
process,
الدكتور
as
إنه
Dr.
لابد
Al-Ubaid mentioned,
أول حاجة إحنا نبدأ
the first step
بالمرحلة
is to
الزمنية.
start with the selection of the time frame.
لابد إن نحن أيضا
It is also important
نضمن
for us to guarantee
الحق اللي هي معرفة الحقيقة
the right to
ونضمن للضحايا
and to
ولأهالينا
guarantee for the
وللمجتمع
family, for the
هذه
victims, for the
حقيقة
families,
المخفي قسرا
that
أين هو.
the fates
حقهم
of
في
the
العدالة يجب
forcibly
أن تكون
disappeared
هناك
will be
لضمان
revealed. It's
المحاسبة
also
وعدم
important for the right to
الإفلات من
justice
العقاب. يجب
to
أن
be
يكون
protected.
هناك أيضا
It's also
تعويضات
important for
شاملة
there to be
للضحايا
comprehensive
حتى
reparations
تكون
for the
هناك
victims so
مسار
that
حقيقي للعدالة
there is a real
الانتقالية
process
لضحايا الإخفاء القسري
for the
بشكل أو
victims of enforced
بآخر.
disappearance.
يجب أن
It's
تكون هناك
also
إصلاح
important for there to be
للمؤسسات
reforms of
القضائية
judicial institutions
حتى يتم هناك أثناء المحاكمات ضمانات
and
بعدم
also
تكرار هذه
through trials or
الانتهاكات
accountability. There will be a
والإسقاط اللي
guarantee
هي
of
جريمة
non-repetition,
الاختفاء
especially this
القسري.
violation of enforced
كل تلك
disappearance.
الحقوق
All of these
يجب أن
rights
تكون للضحية
that would
وللأهالي
need to be
الضحية
maintained
وللمجتمع
or
أيضا
provided to the
تعتبر
victims, to their
بشكل أو
families of the
بآخر
victims, and to the society at
أساسا
large.
لأي جهود
And these
تهدف
are the
إلى
basis
تحقيق
of any
العدالة
attempts to
والمصالحة
achieve
الوطنية وبالتالي
justice
تكون
or national
أطر لمسار
reconciliation,
العدالة
and they would be
الانتقالية.
important
شكرا لك
measures included
أستاذة
in the
رغدة.
transitional justice
كمان في
process.
سؤال
Thank you very much,
بس
Ragda.
مش واضح
There's
جدا.
also, I'm sorry, I apologize. I was
ألفت
disconnected.
أنا
No
برجع
worries,
لك
Ulfat. We'll
بسأل
go
الدكتور
back to you
العبيد
after
على
another
سؤال وأرجع
question to
لسؤالي
Dr.
إليك.
Al-Ubaid, and then we'll go
دكتور
back
في
to your
إحدى
question.
المشاركين طرح هذا
One of the
السؤال: ما هي
participants
الآليات
asked this question:
القانونية
what
والعملية
are the
التي
legal
ترونها
and practical
أكثر
mechanisms
فاعلية
that you believe are the most effective
ضمن إطار العدالة
within the
الانتقالية
process of
لمحاسبة
within the
المسؤولين
transitional
إنصاف
justice
الضحايا
to
وذويهم
hold those
وضمان
the
عدم
perpetrators
تكرار هذه
responsible, to
الممارسات؟
provide justice for the
جزاك
victims and their families, and to ensure non-repetition of these violations?
شكرا
Thank you
السؤال
very much for
سؤال
the
مهم
question. I think it's an
لكن
important question,
أنا بعتقد
but
إنه أهم
I think that
خطوة
the
هو
most
إنه هي
important step, the
تجريم
first
استحقاق
step, is to
استخدام النون
explicitly
الموضوع الثاني إجراء
criminalize
تحقيقات
enforced
فورية
disappearance. The
وشاملة
second is to
الموضوع
conduct
الثالث هو ملاحقة
immediate
الجناة
and
ومساعدتهم
quick investigations. The third
الموضوع
is
الرابع هو ضمان
accountability
حقوق
for the
الضحايا وسعيهم في
perpetrators.
معرفة
And the fourth
الحقيقة
is to guarantee the right of the
بعد كده
victims and their
تنفيذها
families
بالضرر
to
والتعويضات
for truth,
المسألة بتاعت
for
منع
the truth.
التكرار
With
هي
regards to
مهمة لكن هي
non-repetition, it is
بتجي
important, but it comes
بملاحقة
with
وشيء
the
تاني تجي عبر
accountability, and it
الإصلاحات
also comes through
المؤسسية
the
اللي ممكن
institutional
تتم
reform that can
هذه
be
هي
implemented.
بعتقد إنها
I
الخطوات
think that these are
العملية
the practical
اللي
steps
هي نحن بنتكلم عن إنه منع تكرار ما
when we
زالت
talk about, for
الاختفاء
example,
القسري
non-repetition of enforced disappearance. These are the practical steps that can
شكرا
achieve that. Thank you
دكتور.
very much, Dr.
أيضا
Al-Ubaid.
هناك مجموعة من الأسئلة
There are
لكن
still
قبل ما
several
ننتقل
questions,
للأسئلة
but before we move on to
المشاركين خليني
the
أرجع لك
participant
يا
questions,
أستاذ
I wanted
ألفت.
to go back
أستاذ
to,
ألفت، من خلال الطرح أنت تحدثتي عن بعض التوصيات إنه
you mentioned some of the
حول إنشاء
you
المبادرات،
mentioned some
حول
of the
الآليات التي
recommendations
تستخدم
on
هذه
community
إنصاف
initiatives and
الضحايا
also some of the mechanisms that can be used
سؤالي لك ما الذي
to
تحتاجه
resolve this.
هذه
What
الجهود
do these
أو هذه
efforts need
المبادرات
to try to
المتفرقة
turn all of
الطاغية على
these
المجتمع
disparate
المدني
initiatives in civil
إلى
society?
أنت
Can you
تسمعيني؟
hear us?
ألو
Can you hear us?
أستاذة
Well,
ألفت،
ممكن احنا نتكلم، ممكن احنا ايوه اسمعيني.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
كيف ممكن تتحول هذه المبادرات؟
اسمعيني.
Can you hear me?
أيوة
Yeah,
أسمع.
I can hear you.
سؤالي لك إنه
My
برأيك كيف
question
ممكن
to you,
تتحول هذه
from your
المبادرات إلى
perspective,
قوة، أو ما
how
الذي
can
نحتاجه
these
عشان تتحول
initiatives,
هذه المبادرات
how
والجهود
can
إلى
these
قوة ضاغطة
initiatives
لتحقيق
and efforts
نتائج
be
ملموسة؟
turned into a real or be changed or made more effective to achieve tangible results?
ممكن نتكلم عن عدة حلول
I think
مقترحة
there are
على
several
مستوى المجتمع
proposals,
المدني،
whether
وهو
at the level of
توحيد
civil society, and the first step is to
جهود
concert
المنظمات الحقوقية
efforts
ضمن
of
التعاون
rights,
الوطني
human rights
وهذه
organizations as a part
الجريمة
of national and even
من خلال
regional
استمرار في
networks
التوثيق المهني
to
وإعداد
combat this
قاعدة
crime, and also
بيانات
working on
دقيقة
preparing a
وشاملة.
national registry or
ممكن كمان من
database
خلال
that is
كما تكلم
comprehensive. And
دكتور
also, like
العبيد، هو
Dr.
إنهاض
Leber
الضحايا
said,
وأسرهم
the
بجهود
importance of
المناصرة والأعضاء
including
المرشحة
the
للتحدث
victims and
عن
families of the
معاناتهم.
victims and the
هذا على
victims in the
مستوى المجتمع
process. And this
المدني.
is at the level of
وعلى
civil
مستوى
society. At the level,
الدولي
at the
هو
international
تعزيز
level, it's
التواصل مع
important
الجاليات
to
الدولية، فريق
strengthen and
العمل
bolster
اليومي بالإخفاء
communication
القسري.
with international teams working on, and special reporters working on this matter, and also pushing for independent investigation mechanisms and missions. At the national level, it is important to explicitly criminalize enforced disappearance and ensure accountability, and for the abductees file to be included in any future peace negotiations as a humanitarian issue. At the psychosocial and social levels, it's important to establish psychosocial support centers for the victims and their families, and having empowerment or economic empowerment for the families of the victims who have lost their breadwinners. Thank you very much, Ulfat. I go back with an additional question to Dr. Al-Ubaid from Arafat. The question is, what is realistically, what do you believe that
هذا السؤال تقريبا سألوه
I think this question was asked before about the realistic sorry, the second question is, do you believe that including the tribal structure, which is more cohesive than state institutions in the Yemeni context, might be an important form of community support for justice and ensure the non-repetition of these violations? Yes, definitely. There have been many discussions on the role of tribes in customary law in transitional justice. I have a friend, Adil Dashila, who I think has already addressed this issue at length, and I think he could have been very useful for us in this discussion. But first, I want to warn of something. People do not view tribes and customary law as a solution for everything. There will be some things that are filtered out. There will be some crimes that tribes cannot deal with, or some sorts of violations, types of violations that cannot be included in the tribal or customary law. There would need to be a way of filtering this out, because the role of the tribes and the role of tribes and the role of customary law can be useful. And there are some serious violations where tribes might not play a role. But with regards to enforced disappearance, because it is linked to official state entities, I believe that the primary role is not for customary law or for tribes. The main role here comes in for other official entities, for official entities to be held accountable, while at the same time providing the information that is needed for reparations to be provided. After reaching this result, then we can maybe go into the use of tribal mechanisms or tribal reconciliation. But the main purpose of truth seeking, I think this requires work at the official level. And like I said, this would also require forensic science. It would also require DNA identification. And for us not to mix these things up, yes, it's important to use all forms of support that we can have in Yemen, whether they are tribal or conciliatory or any of these other things. But at the same time, when setting these foundations, many of the crimes will not be dealt with through traditional frameworks, but will have to be dealt with through legislation or through international law.
كمان دكتور مروان
Thank you very much. Marwan also had another additional question of how can we operationalize international and regional mechanisms to combat impunity and to ensure that this very contentious topic is included. I also saw another question that was even more complicated. They said that there are entities like the Houthis, for example, or the STC that have clear links to external state actors, and how could we ensure that we hold them accountable? It's very simple at this point. As long as we can document and identify the statistics, we can clearly identify who is responsible, and there is no statute of limitations. There might be an importance now, at least in an interim manner, for people to postpone some of these issues to a later stage. But anyone who has committed these violations must be held accountable. And the question is, why would they agree to peace if they're going to be held accountable as a part of that process? And I believe that there are many complications when it comes to transitional justice, but at the end of the day, one of its outcomes cannot be impunity. And what happened in 2011 was very clear, that when you give immunity, what do you expect to happen? But at the time when that comes, there might be some very smart ways
للبدء
to
بالأشياء اللي
postpone
ممكنة،
issues, set
لكن في نفس
priorities,
الوقت
start with what is
بيجي
possible, but
فيهم
there will
إحنا
come a
في
time when
مرات
accountability is
كثيرة
needed.
عندنا
In
نموذج
Africa, for
حسين
example,
حبرة
we have
رئيس تشاد.
Hussein Habra, the president of Chad.
هرب من تشاد
He
بعد كم 20
he
سنة، في
escaped.
الآخر تمت محاكمته في
He was
السنغال.
tried in Senegal maybe 20 years after committing
فطالما
the
تم
crimes that he
تحديد
committed.
المسؤولية
And so as long as we've already
إلا
set
تحديد
who is
المسؤولية نفسه
responsible, who is the
وتحديد
perpetrator,
مرتكبي
and
الجرم هو
who
أول
the
خطوة
perpetrators are,
للمساعدة
this is the
للحقائق.
first step for
قد
accountability.
يتم تعطيل العقاب
It might be
أو
it might
التبعات
be delayed.
القانونية
The legal
لأسباب قد تكون
ramifications might be
سياسية
delayed for
أو
political
اقتصادية أو
reasons
إلى
or
آخره،
reasons linked to the
لكن لا يمكن لأي
negotiations,
أحد إنه
but no
يثبت
one
هذه المساءلة
can
بأي نوع من التقادم
can
أو
or
فيما
can believe
شهد
that there is
حتى
a
اليمن
statute of
كأي نوع من
limitations
العفو
or that there would be any
الشامل
kind of
والمحيط.
general amnesty or immunity that is given to the
شكرا
perpetrators.
دكتور.
Thank you
خليني
very much,
أرجع
Dr. Al-Ubaid.
لأستاذة
We'll
رغدة.
go back now
أستاذة
to
رغدة برضو في سؤال
Raghda. Raghda,
ما
there's a
هي
question
أبرز
of what
التحديات
are
التي
the main
تواجه
challenges
مسؤولين حسن حسن
facing
وضمان مساعدة
the truth
مرتكبي
seeking
الهجرة
for
في
the
المنطقة؟
enforced disappearance and also what lead to the impunity of the perpetrators of these
أعتقد
violations.
إنه من أهم
I think that
التحديات
one of the main
إنه
challenges
ما فيش
is
لحد
that
الآن
there
قاعدة
still isn't a
بيانات
clear
كاملة
and
وشاملة
full
بأسماء المخفيين حقا.
database
يعني إلى
or
الآن كل
registry of the
المنظمات تقوم
forcibly disappeared.
برصد
Up until now,
وتوثيق
all of these,
هؤلاء الضحايا،
all
لكن إلى الآن لا
organizations work
توجد
on documenting
عدد.
these case
مثلا
files on
نستطيع
their
أن
own, but there
نقول
isn't
أن
a clear
هناك
number that we
كذا
can
كذا
say
رقم
there's
موجود في
this
اليمن
such and such
للمخفيين
number of
قسرا وتم
individuals in
توثيقه
Yemen who have
بطرق
been forcibly
منهجية
disappeared, and
صحيحة.
that
من
this has
التحديات
bين
اللي دائما تواجه
done with a
اللي هي مسألة
clear
الاختفاء القسري،
methodology. With
إنه
regards to cases of
أغلب
enforced
مرتكبي
disappearance,
هذه
most of the
الجرائم
perpetrators of these crimes
لا يتم محاكمتهم،
are not
وهذه
held
تعتبر
accountable.
أكبر
And this
التحديات
is one of the biggest
في
challenges
اليمن،
that we
وخاصة
face in
إنه
Yemen,
المسؤولين
especially since
العسكريين والأمنيين
military
مدفوعين
commanders and security
بأطراف
commanders are
ليبيا،
affiliated with parties to
يتمتعون
the conflict and have
بالحصانة
the
اللي
immunity
كانت
that
في
this relationship grants them.
2011 اللي
The
هي
immunity, for
حصانة من
example, that was
الملاحقة
granted in 2011,
القضائية،
immunity from
واللي هو
legal
هذا الشيء يشجع
prosecution.
على استمرار الجريمة،
And this only
وبالتالي
encouraged
عمل على
that these
زعزعة
crimes
ثقة
continue to be
الضحايا
committed.
ودخولهم في
And it has also
نظام
shaken the
العدالة.
confidence that the victims and the
برضو
families of
كما
the victims
ممكن
have had
نقول إنه من
in
أهم
the justice
التحديات
system. One of the
بمسألة
biggest
اللي
challenges is
هي
also
مكافحة جريمة
when it comes to
الاختفاء القسري
dealing
غياب
with enforced
الإرادة
disappearance is the
السياسية.
lack of a
مثلا إحنا
political
عندنا في
will. In
اليمن
Yemen,
موجود
for
جميع
example,
الأطراف
all of the
المتحاربة
warring
وكل جهة
parties,
لديها
each one of these
أجندة، وكل
actors have
جهة
their own agendas.
لديها
They have
أجهزة،
their
لديها
own
أدوار،
agencies, they
لديها
have their own media
فتعتقد
arms.
هذه
And so the
الجهة
fact
ما فيش
that there are so
جهة
many of them, we
واحدة
don't
إنه
have a single
نستطيع إنه
entity
نركن
that we can
عليها
rely on
ونقول إنه سنلتف عليها ونقول إرادة
and say
سياسية، لكن نظل
to
الحكومة
create this
الشرعية
political
هي
will. But
التي
the
نستطيع
internationally
أن
recognized
نعول
government is
عليها
still the
بأنها
entity
تعمل
that we
على
can
المصادقة على
uh,
هذه الاتفاقية حتى
that
لا
we can
يتم الإفلات
rely on
الجماع
or
منها،
lobby to
بالإضافة إلى
ratify
أنه
this
الأدلة
convention so that
والتحقيقات
the perpetrators do not get
أثناء
impunity.
يحدث
It's
هناك
also there are
صعوبة
also
بجمع هذه الأدلة
difficulties in gathering
والتحقيق
the
لجريمة
evidence necessary
الاختفاء
when carrying out the
القسري،
investigations for
وذلك
enforced disappearance.
شيء
And I
طبيعي
think
إنه
this is
نظرا
natural.
لشدة هذه
This
الجريمة
is natural because
يتم
of the
إخفاء
secrecy of
الضحايا،
this
إنكار وجودهم،
violation, where these victims are hidden,
ما
where
فيش
their
يصبح
fates
جمع
are
الأدلة
concealed. And in this
للتحقيق
case, in these
للملاحقة
cases, it
القضائية
becomes
شيء صعب
difficult to
جدا،
gather
وخاصة
evidence
إنه ما
for court
اسم المخفي
cases.
قسرا أساسا لا
Individuals who are
يقيد
forcibly
بالسجلات
disappeared, they are not
الرسمية،
included in any
بالتالي
of the formal lists of
يتم تهريب
prisoners or
للأدلة،
detentions.
ترهيب للشهود أحيانا.
So this
هذا
evidence
الشيء
is destroyed,
بطبيعة الحال
witnesses are
المحققين
threatened,
والنيابة العامة لا
and
تستطيع أن
for
حتى
public
تمارس
prosecutors,
الإجراءات الرسمية.
they cannot
استمرار
carry out the
النزاع إلى
necessary
الآن
steps. Also, the fact
برضو
that the conflict is
يؤدي
still
كثير
ongoing
من
is a major part of
ازدياد
this
معدل
challenge.
جريمة
And this has
الاختفاء
led to this
القسري، وأعتقد إنه هذه من
this
الأسباب
violation
الكثيرة.
continuing to be
بالنسبة
committed. And
للنساء
this is an additional challenge.
فقط
Also,
قبل
with regards to women specifically,
احنا لما
when we
نتكلم في أعداد كبيرة
there
من
are
النساء،
large
لكن
numbers
بسبب
of women
الرتبة
who have been
الاجتماعية
forcibly
لهذه
disappeared, but because of the
الجريمة
social
الاختفاء
stigma of
يفضل
this crime,
الرجل أو الأب
the
أن
the
يقول أن
families prefer to say
زوجته
that their
ابنته
wife or their
أيا
daughter
كان
or whoever
قريته
it
إنه
is, that
ماتت، على أن يقول
she
أنه
died
تم
rather than
الاختفاء
saying that she
القسري.
was
وهذا
forcibly
بالنسبة
disappeared.
للنساء يمثل
And this is an
أكبر
additional challenge
تحدي
that women
لمكافحة
face,
جريمة
or that female victims
الاختفاء
face when dealing
القسري
with the
في اليمن.
crime of enforced
شكرا
disappearance in Yemen.
دكتور
Thank you
أستاذة
very
رغدة،
much, Raghda.
ونقطة كثير
This was
مهمة
a very
ذكرت
important point.
فيما يتعلق بالنساء. فعليا احنا نعاني من مشاكل كثيرة في هذا الجانب، وهذا برضو برضو خليني
And
أفتح
these are
نقاش
some of the
مع
complications
الأستاذة
that we have. And this
ألفت
leads to a
إنه
question to
خلينا
Ulfat.
نتطرق للمجتمع
When we talk
المدني.
about civil
كيف
society,
يمكن
how
للمجتمع
can civil
المدني سواء
society,
ألفت إنه
Ulfat,
يشارك في دعم
how can it
الضحايا
support victims and their families as a part of this transitional justice process.
أستاذة ألفت أنت
Ulfat, can
تسمعينا؟
you hear us?
ولا مشكلة في النت؟
You might still be having internet
لا
problems.
تكلموا.
Can you hear me now?
ايوه ايوه اسمع.
Yes, we can hear you.
واحنا طرقنا انه تكون دور
We
المنظمات
mentioned
المجتمع
the role of
المدني في
civil
اعلان
society
الضحايا هو
organizations in
تمثيل
supporting
بسط
the
الحالات
victims, also in
المختلفة
documenting these cases,
يتعرض لها اهاليهم
that
وإضافات
the
الأطفال
and the
نفسهم.
additional
ونحن
suffering of their
نعلم
families.
نريد ان يكون هناك جهود
We want for there to be
كبيرة جدا
significant
في
efforts
الأسر
to do this, to
المستضعفين
support the
حتى
families of
لتخفيف
the
معاناتهم.
victims,
مثلا إحنا لو
so that we
تكلمنا
can
عن
support them in their suffering. If we talk, for example,
الدعم النفسي
if we
اللي
talk about the
بيقدموه
psychosocial
المجتمع
support that is
المدني
being provided by civil
للمختطفين
society organizations.
أستاذة
Sorry,
نعم
Ulfat.
إحنا تحدثنا عن
Yes,
دور
we've already
المجتمع
spoken about
المدني.
the role of.
أنا أقول لك إحنا
We've
تحدثنا عن
spoken
هذا
about the
الدور
role of
المجتمع
civil
المدني.
society. Could you repeat the question then?
أقول لك إحنا تحدثنا
We've
في هذا
already
الدور
spoken
الآن
about
إحنا
this role,
نحاول نشوف إنه كيف
but we're
يمكن
trying
أن
to see
يكون
now,
مثل ما ذكر في
just like
توصيات
it was
الاقتراح عن الدكتور أهمية
Al-Ubaid
إشراك
mentioned in his
أسر الضحايا
recommendations,
في
the
مسارات
importance of
العدالة
ensuring that
بشكل عام.
victims and
كيف
families of
يمكن
the victims are
للمجتمع
included.
يشارك في
But we
دعم
wanted to talk
الضحايا
about how
وصنع
can
الصوت
society
ضعيف
as a
جدا.
whole support.
الإنترنت معك.
Yeah, you seem to be
أقول لك
having
كيف
internet
يمكن أن
problems.
أن يشارك
The
أن
question is
يساهم كيف يمكن للمجتمع
how
أن
can
يشارك في
society
دعم
as a whole
الضحايا
participate in
وأسرهم
supporting the victims
للاندماج
and
ضمن
their
مسارات
families
العدالة أو لوضع
as a
ضمن
part of
مسارات
the
العدالة.
transitional justice
الصوت
process?
واضح؟
Was the question clear?
لا عندك
ايوه ايوه الان
Yes,
واضح.
now it's clear.
دور الأسر الضحايا
The role of the families of
خاصة
the victims,
بمسألة
especially
العدالة
when it comes
الائتلافية
to
ضعيفة
transitional
جدا. هناك من
justice,
الأهالي
the victims'
إنه
families are not
أول شيء
included.
الضحايا نفسهم عندما
The
مثلا
first point
يتم
is
الإفراج
the
عنه
victim
والوصول
themselves.
إلى
If they are
مكتب
released
الرابطات
and
المهذبة
when they reach
للمختطفين،
the Abductees
نود أن
Mothers
نوضح
Association, when we
حالتهم
try to
ونود أن
document
نفتكر
these
الانتهاكات
cases
التي
or
تعرض
document
لها
the
في
violations that they were subject to, she was disconnected.
للأسف الإنترنت
Unfortunately,
عند
the internet
أستاذة ألفت كثير سيء.
that
خلينا
Ulfat
نخبط
is using
بالسؤال.
is not
ممكن
stable.
أستاذة
Let's
رغدة
take
والدكتور
an
العبيد يجاوبوا
additional
عليه. ما
question
هو
that Ragda and
من
Dr.
مروان
Al-Ubaid
غالب
can answer. This is a question from
ما هو
Marwan
النموذج
Ghalib.
المؤسسي والتقني
What
الأمثل
is the
لإطلاق
best
سجل وطني
mechanism
مستقل ومخفي
for a
خاص
national
باليمن
registry for the
يبني
forcibly
قواعد
disappeared in Yemen that would
بيانات المجتمع
merge
المدني
the
والبلاغات
databases used
الإلكترونية
by
وقوائم
civil
اتفاقية
society
ستوكهولم
organizations,
مع
the
ضمان
statements
التحقق
and figures of
والخصوصية
international
وموافقة
organizations,
الأسر
and the list from the
والمعايير
Stockholm
التمييز
Agreement,
بين المخفي
while also
والمحتجز والمدبر.
differentiating
نعم
between
دكتور.
those who have been forcibly
يعني
disappeared and those who have
أول
been
زي ما
detained.
قلت يعني إيجاد جهة رسمية
Like I said, the first
عندها
point
ولاية
is
محددة
to create a commission or a
والناس
body that
تتفق
has a
فيها، خاصة
specific
الضحايا،
mandate
على الضوابط
where the victims can
الرئيسية
also reach an agreement on the main
للتوثيق ولأيضا
points
كيفية
needed for
التعامل مع
documentation and also how
المعلومات،
to deal
يعني
with this information,
حمل
with this data,
المعلومات وعدم تعريض
ensuring that
الضحايا
the
لأي
victims are not
ضرر
subject to any
جانبي.
additional harm or burden because of
فمسألة
this.
إيجاد جهة رسمية عندها
And
ولاية
so creating
محددة
this
يعني
entity that
موجود
has a
لوائح أو قانون.
specific
أنا
mandate,
بفتكر إنه
I
البداية
think
قد
is an
تكون
important
من
step.
اللجنة الوطنية،
But the
لأنه
beginning
اللجنة
might
المتكلم
come from the
عليها
National
قوي في التعامل مع الجرائم
Commission to
المرتكبة
investigate
ضد
alleged
الشرعية
human
في
rights
اليمن.
violations. It has experience
كانت
in
في فترة
investigating and
الانتقال من
monitoring.
سجون
And I remember in Yemen,
الحزام
there
الأمني
was a shift from the prisons that were
والنخب
maintained by
هذه
the security
كلها
belt forces and the
إلى
various elite forces
السجون
to
الرسمية.
the formal, where
وفي ناس
detainees were
كانوا
moved to
محتجزين
formal prisons. And
بالإرهاب
there were
والإرهاب.
individuals who have been detained
واتضح
on
إنه
charges of terrorism.
في
And there
إحصائيات
were
عن
statistics
أمهات
that the Abductees
المختطف
Mothers
الأمهات
Association
المختطفين
had
إنه في أعداد
that
ما
showed that
زالت
there
ما
was still a
معروفة
large number of
فين هم
individuals whose
أو
fates were
مختفين
unknown,
رئيسيا
that
ما
were
معروفين
still
هم.
forcibly disappeared.
أيضا إلى الآن بيبحثوا عن
And they're
معلوماتهم.
still, their families are still trying to
ففي
find
جهة
information
رسمية
on them. And so it's
المهم
important to have
القرار
this formal
يوضح
entity, but it's
الولاية،
it's
لكن يكون
clear
في
for it to
مساعدة
have the
فعلية
mandate, but also to
من
have real
منظمات المجتمع
participation
المدني
from civil
ومن
society
الضحايا مع
organizations
الجهات
and the
الرسمية
victims,
في
along with
تحديد
formal
الضوابط
actors, to
وفي
set
تحديد
the
الأسس الأساسية
determinants and
للتعامل
the
مع أي
groundwork
مخاطر
for any
ناتجة عن هذا
risks and how
الموضوع،
they would be dealt with.
وأيضا الضوابط الخاصة بحماية
And
المعلومات
also
وحماية الضحايا
the principles or
بحيث إنه يكون
standards for
في
the
شروط
safety and
معلنة،
privacy
وهو
of this
بيكون زي
data.
غربال يعني كل
And all
المعلومات
of this
بتجي
information will then flow into that
وبتتصفى وبيطلع منها سجل
that
وبيعدل
commission or
وبيحسن
entity, and it will
وبيعدل
work on
وبيحسن
creating a
وبينشر
registry and improving
الكل
it.
ممكن يتم يعني.
And I think that would be
وبرضه
the
هذا
natural step to
السؤال
take.
يعني أو هنا
And this
برضه
also
في
takes
نفس
us
السياق
in
برضه
that
في
same
سؤال ممكن
context.
أستاذة
There was a
رغدة
question that
إنه كيف
Ragda might
يمكن
be better
أن
able
يخدم
to
هذا
answer.
السجل إذا
Of
تم
this
استخدام هذا
registry,
السجل
if
كيف
such
يمكن
a
أن يخدم هذا
registry
السجل
is
مسارات
created,
العدالة
how might it
الانتقالية
serve
وكيف تشتغل
the process of transitional justice in with regards to truth-seeking, reparations, and non-repetition. Other than Yemen ratifying the Convention on Enforced Disappearance, how could it help or support transitional justice?
أعتقد إنه إنشاء
I believe that establishing the commission that Dr. Al-Ubaid mentioned, an independent commission or committee, and also to have a mechanism for coordination with civil society organizations, that everyone can, all of the efforts are concerted through this commission to establish a registry. But in Yemen, we had an issue that we had discussed before, which is there are people who were killed during the beginning of the conflict, and it was difficult for these for their fates to be recovered. And after the areas were liberated, many of the bodies were buried without having been identified or documented. And so I think that a large number of these individuals who had been forcibly disappeared have become lost for this reason. But if there is a commission that is established, a commission that will be responsible for documenting these victims based on national legislation, and also while using international mechanisms, then these steps will guarantee that there is accountability and that there is no impunity, and that there are trials that will appease all of the relevant actors, so that we can start to prepare Yemeni society for a shift towards transitional justice. But before all of that, it's important for civil society organizations to raise awareness and to work on advocacy on the importance of transitional justice and what transitional justice is. During the documentation and monitoring, and I'm sorry, Kabul, for taking so long, but we always make sure to inform the victims on the importance of documentation. Some of the victims or the families of some of the victims might not think the documentation process is important, but we would try to inform them of transitional justice. And I think that within civil society or this group of elites, there isn't sufficient awareness raising on what transitional justice means, so let alone the victims and the families of the victims. And so it's important to focus on the principles and the concepts of transitional justice, both to the elites and also to the grassroots base, in order to prepare society for the case of transitional justice law being passed. Because the crime of enforced disappearance did not target a specific segment of Yemeni society. It has affected everyone. Journalists and academics, civilians, women, children, everyone has been affected by enforced disappearance without exception. And so it's important for there to be real awareness-raising efforts carried out by civil society organizations. Thank you very much, Ragda, for that point. And yes, this is something that is very important. I'm sorry to come back in. My internet came back. Yes, we'll go. I wanted to talk about the role of the victims and the victims' families. Yes, but if you could just do it in a minute or even a bit less, because I had another question that I wanted to ask you. So if you could answer it maybe in a minute or half a minute, because we have another question for you. Can you hear us, Ulfat?
تفضلي.
Ulfat, can you hear us?
تسمعيني الآن؟
Can you hear me now?
أيوة أسمعك. ممكن تجاوبينا في نص
Yeah, if you could
دقيقة
please answer that in
عشان في
half a minute, because there's another question.
أوكي لما
Okay,
تجاوب.
when you
أنا
come back.
أتفق معك
I
أستاذ
agree with you,
رغدة
Ragda,
في
that
الحاجة
it is
اللي
important for there to
في
be
مفترض
awareness
نركز
raising
عليها
on
لأنه
the
لسه
concept of
كثير
transitional
نتحدث
justice. But we
وتواجه
should always remember that many of the
أهالي
challenges that
الضحايا
face the
تجديد
families
غياب
of the
القانون
victims,
هذا
including the
يجعلهم
threats and
خايفين
the
دائما ما
the
يتخذوا
absence
هذه
of the law,
الخطوات.
this
في
might
سؤال
always
هنا
scare them to take the
أستاذة
steps.
رانيا
There's a
ممكن
question here
تشوفي
from
السؤال
Rania. I
هذا
don't know
ممكن
if you can
تجاوبي
see it,
عليه اللي هو
Ragda. There's a
ما
question
دور
on what is the
المنظمات
role
المعنية في الرصد
of the
الانتهاكات
relevant
لرفع رصد
organizations in
الانتهاكات
submitting
للمحاكم
these
الدولية
case files to
ومحاكمة
international
الإناء
courts
وإنصاف
and to
الضحايا
hold the
ولا تبقى
perpetrators
تلك
accountable to
الملفات
ensure that
حديثة
these
الإدراك
case
ممكن في
files
دقيقة
are
واحدة
actually
صح
utilized.
أعتقد إنه دور
I
منظمات
think that the role
المجتمع
of civil
المدني
society
في عملية
organizations
الرصد
is in
والتوثيق
documenting
ملف
these
قانوني
violations and to
نستطيع
creating legal
بعد
case
ذلك
files that
تسليمه
will
إلى المحاكم
then
سواء
be
المحاكم
submitted
الدولية أو
to
هناك
courts,
بعض
whether international
المنظمات
courts
لديها
or even
القدرة
some
على
organizations who have the
التوثيق
ability to
وإرسال
coordinate
هذا
and to submit
الملفات
these case files
للمحامين الخواص
to the
من
UN
هؤلاء
special
المقررين
reporters. And
الخواص
these special reporters include
أوكي من هؤلاء المقررين المقرر الخاص بجريمة
there
الاختفاء
is a special
القسري
reporter on the
لذلك
crime of
عملية
enforced
التوثيق
disappearance. And
القانوني
so
والرصد
the
والتوثيق
legal
أصبحت تحتاج
documentation and
لكل
monitoring
فرد من هذه
for
الانتهاكات
any of these
بسبب
violations is very
جريمة
important,
الاختفاء
especially for
القسري
the crime
يجب
of
أن
enforced
تكون
disappearance.
بشكل متكامل
and they would need to be comprehensive,
تمر على جميع المراحل
and they would need to go through all of the stages to ensure that these case files are complete and cannot be later appealed in any of the entities that they would be submitted to. There are so as journalists, for example, there are organizations that focus on their files, and they submit it to the special report, relevant special reporters. And for each one of these crimes that we've spoken about, there is a special reporter that is tasked or responsible with it. Dr. Labeid, did you have any additional points? There was a very important question of why do we not ask the internationally recognized government to ratify the agreement, the Convention on Forced Disappearance, as if it was a simple matter. I felt like we might give people the wrong impression that as long as enforced disappearance has not been criminalized, that no crime was committed.
والاختفاء الغصري نفسه هو مجموعة من
No,
الجرائم
to the contrary, enforced disappearance is a series or a number of crimes, but they're all criminalized, but arbitrary detention, detention outside of the scope of the law, depriving someone of legal standing or legal status, not providing legal support. These are all points
بيعطي المساءلة
that lead to accountability for these types of violations, even contribution to torture or to extrajudicial killing. These are all criminalized. So when we say that this wasn't explicitly criminalized, it was not explicitly criminalized as a series of crimes which would help bolster or support attempts to combat it. With regards to international courts, I believe that systemic internal documentation that is centralized is a priority. If there is a need for international mechanisms, the Special Working Group on Enforced Disappearance is the first point for communication. Anyone who has a case that has been documented of enforced disappearance, they would need to get it to this working group, and this would confirm that this case would then reach the official entities. And they would demand that the government to provide the necessary information on these specific case files that have been documented and submitted. But I also do not want people, I want our efforts to be concerted. It's important to have a central registry with a clear time frame that people agree to from 1962 on, etc. I think is the priority. It's important. The priority now is for there to be internal documentation so that there can be a clear registry that we can use during the transitional justice process. Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Ubaid. We go back to Ulfat, if you could in half a minute maybe answer the previous question, please.
تمام على بس المعايير للنت شوية.
Thank you very much. You spoke about the role of victims and the victims' families in the transitional justice process.
من خلال رواية الحقيقة وحفظ الدرجات.
Through truth seeking and memorialization, this is the victims and their families are the ones that can help ensure that these what happened is memorialized for the collective memory. They will help break the silence and any attempts to deny or conceal these crimes. They will also play an important role in drafting the policies and mechanisms. They have the right to participate in designing transitional justice, and they would also need to have their voices heard and ensure that these solutions are the real solutions to the problems that they face and not just symbolic solutions. Their participation will also give credibility to this process, and the families of the victims are the ones who will push forward any form of accountability and to combat impunity. They will also submit these case files to the judicial system and work on public opinion, also by defending the importance of reparations and compensation for the families, and they will be able to determine the psychological, social, or economic compensation reparations that they would need and that they would be included in reintegration programs. Also, through any kind of national reconciliation without the inclusion of the victims will be lacking, and their inclusion will ensure that there will be guarantees of non-repetition and not just a political settlement. And also, if we talk about the role of civil society organizations, if victims like the Abductees Mothers Association and other associations in Yemen, they're the ones who are leading these efforts, and they remind society of the files that cannot be ignored or cannot be swept away. Also ensuring non-repetition by contributing to the institutional reforms that would ensure non-repetition of these violations. Thank you very much, Ulfat. I also had an additional question, if we could have it answered as quickly as possible. I wanted to start with Dr. Lubaid of how can we balance accountability and justice on one side, and striving for peace and reconciliation on the other. And we'll conclude with this question. Who wanted to start by answering this question? It's the crux of everything.
الأهم في الموضوع إنه
The more important point here
الحقيقة إبراز
is
الحقيقة إيجاد الحق
revealing the truth.
كخطوة
I think that
أولى
is an
قبل ما
important
ندخل في
first step
المساءلة
before we
قبل
go
ما
into
ندخل في العفو
accountability and before
والمصالحة
we go into
خطوة خطوة
amnesty and
الأهم إنه
reconciliation.
تثبيت الحقائق
But what's important now is
إنه
to uncover
لابد إنه
the truth.
تثبت
It's
الحقائق
important for the truth
بحيث
to
إنه
be
الناس
revealed so
تحدد
that people can determine
أنواع
the
المساءلة
types or the forms
المطلوبة
of accountability that are
وفي
needed.
المساءلة وفي
And
المصالحة
when it comes to
أو العفو
accountability or reconciliation,
الرأي الأعلى
the
للضحايا
victims are the ones who should have the say.
إيجاد الحقيقة هو العنصر
And
الأول
that's why
والمهم
truth seeking is the
بعد
first
كده
important
تحديد
component,
المساءلة
afterwards
وأنواعها
determining the
حتى لو كانت
forms
في
and shapes
معتقلات
of
سياسية
accountability, even if there are some political settlements at the time.
يكون للضحايا
The
فيها دور
victims will
لكن
need to play
بالنسبة
a role here.
للمصالحة
But with
والعفو
regards
كلها
to
للإنشاء الدور الأعلى
accountability,
والفاصل
the
المفروض يكون
main role
للضحايا
should
أكثر
be for
من
the victims
المراحل
more than
الأخرى.
any of the other stages.
شكرا دكتور.
Thank you very much, Dr.
خليني
Al-Ubaid.
أسألك
Raghda, if
أستاذ
you could
أحسن.
please answer that question in less than half a minute.
أنا مع رأي الدكتور
I agree with
العبيد
Dr. Al-Ubaid
إظهار
that it's important
الحقيقة
first
أولا
for the
قبل
truth
كل
to be
شيء
revealed
يجب
before
أن
anything else.
يعرف
The
الضحية
victims
وأهالي
and the
الضحية
families of the
من
victims
المرتكب
need to know who the perpetrator
لهذه
of this
الجريمة، من
violation
الذي قام
was,
بحرمان
who
العائلة
deprived the
أكثر
family
من سنين العمر أحيانا
of years of their lives,
سنين الشباب
where people
لهذا
might
الضحية.
lose
يجب
the whole
معرفة
period of their youth
هذه
to these
الحقيقة
violations.
حتى
And so it's
بعد
important for
ذلك
the truth to be
يتم
uncovered, after which
دراسة السياق
we can look into the context, the local context of the victims, what their needs are,
تمهيدا لمرحلة
in order
المصالحة.
to prepare for a
يجب أن تكون هناك
reconciliation
حقيقة،
stage.
تكون هناك مساءلة وبعد كذا تتم
There would
إجراء
need to
عملية
be a
المصالحة.
truth seeking and accountability, after which there can
أستاذة
be
ألفت برضو في
reconciliation.
نص دقيقة لو
Ulfat, if you
سمحتي
could
نفس
please
السؤال
answer the
اللي
same
جاوبنا عليه.
question also in half a minute, please.
ممكن إذا قلنا مسألة المساءلة هدفها
I think
الأساسي
the
هو
main
عدم
main
من العقاب
objective
وضمان
of
حقوق الضحايا
accountability is to
وكمان
ensure that the
العدالة
perpetrators do not have
الإنسانية.
impunity, and
لكن
this will
أيضا
also
فكرة تشغيل
guarantee
المصالح تثير
transitional
نزاعات
justice.
شديدة.
But if it
أما
is
بالنسبة
strictly
للمصالحة هي تسعى
implemented, then it
لمعالجة
might lead
الإنسان
to further
الاجتماعية
cycles. But
والسياسية وكمان
reconciliation is an
لا تعني
attempt to
نسيان
reconcile.
الجرائم
But
بل
this does
تعني
not
الاعتراف
mean
بها وفتح
forgetting the
المجال
crimes, but
للعيش
to recognize
المشترك
them
بعد ذلك.
and to try to
والمصالحة
coexist
الحقيقية لا
and to
تتم إلا إذا
transition
شعر
afterwards.
الضحايا
And
أن
there can only be
حقوقهم
real
محترمة
reconciliation if the victims feel that their rights have been
شكرا
taken into
جزيلا
account and
لك.
that the
في
truth has
برضو
been
حنكر
revealed.
آخر
Thank you
سؤال
very
لأنه
much.
مهم
And the
جدا
final
والوقت
question, because it is
قريب.
a very important question, even though we are coming close to the end of our time,
باعتبار أنه حفظ الذاكرة
because
جزء أصيل من مفهوم
memorialization is an
العدالة
important
الانتقالية
part of transitional
وتأثيرها
justice,
على
and because of the
الضحايا
impact that it has
ودوليا
on the
ودوليا
victims
كيف
and their
يمكن أن نضمن
relatives,
سردية
how can we
وطنية
ensure that there is a
للتي
national
تكفل
narrative
فيها هؤلاء
for
الضحايا
the
بالشكل الذي
violations
يساعد
that were
على عدم
committed
ترك
to ensure
الجرائم
that
المعنوية مفتوحة؟
these wounds do not remain
وهل من
open?
دور
And
يمكن
is there a role
الدارسين
that
المدنيين
that civil
يساهموا
society
فيه من
activists can
الآن في هذه
play now
السرديات
to help
الوثائقية
bolster
للأحداث
these
وعدم السماح
narratives and
للأطراف
to ensure
للاطلاع
that
في
the
الذاكرة
warring
المستقبلية
parties
في أقل من
do
نصف
not
دقيقة؟ تفضل دكتور لو
exploit
سمحت.
this collective memory? Dr. Abid.
التوثيق ثم
I think
الترحيل بالنسبة
documentation
للأشخاص
is
التي
very
حصلت
important
ده
for
نمرة
all of the
واحد.
events that
نمرة
have occurred.
اثنين
That's the
على
first step.
الأقل
And the second
السماع
is at least
لمعاناة
the importance of listening
ذوي
to the suffering
الضحايا
of the
الأهل
families of the victims.
الناس اللي موجودين
The, the,
الآن عندهم
the families and these
عندهم يعني
individuals,
stories
they
to
have
tell.
stories to tell, and it's important for
أستاذة
that to be
رغدة
taken
في
into
أقل من
account.
نص دقيقة
Thank you,
برضه
Dr.
حبيت
Labaid.
أجاوب
Ragda,
على
if you could also
السؤال
answer that
معلش
same
سامحني.
question in half a minute or less.
أوكي
Thank
أستاذة
you.
ألفت
Oh,
ممكن
okay.
تعليقي على السؤال
Ulfat,
في أقل
if
من
you
نص
could
دقيقة؟
answer that question.
ممكن نقول إنها تأثيره على
I think we
الضحية
can say that its
واعتراف بمعاناة
impact on
الدعم النفسي
the
أو
victims
تحقيق
is
العدالة
recognition of
الأكاديمية
their suffering and also a
وتكون حاجز
form of
معهم يمكن
symbolic
الاعتراف الرسمي
justice. And
بالانتهاكات
this can be
والاعتذار
done through
العفوي من
recognition
الدولة
of
أو
the
التجديد
violations
العنيفة
and also an
أو
apology
إصلاحات
from the state, and
القوانين.
also reforming the laws and
شكرا
legislation
جزيلا لك.
that allow this to
شكرا
happen. Thank you
لكم
very much. I
جميعا.
would like to thank all of our
وفي
panelists
نهاية هذا اليوم
for their
أقول
time,
لكم
for
كنا
sharing their
نفتقر
expertise.
ضيفتنا التي
And we
قدمت
conclude our
الرائعة.
seminar for
أن
today, through which we
الاحتفاء
reiterate that
القسري
enforced
بالقنبلة الغير
disappearance is
مفعولة
not just a
بالعدالة
person who is
القانونية
missing. It
والحق.
is a lack of
ما
justice
لم تكتشف
and a
مصالح
lack of
المخفيين أو
reassurance
إعادة
for the
اعتبارهم
families and
بحقوقهم
for the
سيظل الجرح
communities. And if
مفتوحا
these
في
issues
أسر
are not
المجتمع.
resolved, this will continue
يعرقل
to be an
المصالحة
open
ويمثل
wound that
السلام.
will hinder
العدالة ليست تلفا،
reconciliation.
بل هي الطريق
Justice is not a
الوحيد لإنهاء
luxury.
دائرة
It
الألم
is the
وضمان
only way
المستقبل
forward
الذي
for us
تشهد
to
المآسي.
sure that
شكرا
I'd like to thank
للدكتور
Dr.
العبيد،
Ubaid. I would like
شكرا
to
أستاذة
thank
ألفت، شكرا
Ulfat,
أستاذة رغدة،
Ragda,
شكرا
and to all
للجميع،
of
شكرا
the
لكل
audience and
المشاركين من شاركوا
participants.
في إبقاء هذه
Thank you for
الذاكرة.
your
شكرا
time.
لأن الذاكرة لا تموت
This is a
وهي
very
بذرة العدالة
important
التي
file, and this is
ستأتي.
the
شكرا
seed of
لتفاعلكم
justice in the future.
ولنا
Thank
لقاء
you
إن
for
شاء
your
الله يوم الاثنين
engagement, and we will
القادم.
see you on Monday.
شكرا للجميع.
Thank you and goodbye.